Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep. Tonight, as you settle into comfort, think for a moment about the sound of rain on glass, the gentle rhythm that has lulled countless souls to sleep. Let that rhythm carry you now into the quiet corridors of the Westfield Police Department, where Detective Captain Amanda Foster has learned that the most profound truths often emerge in the spaces between official reports. Asterisk, the Westfield Police Department occupied a converted Victorian mansion on the outskirts of downtown, its brick facade weathered by decades of Atlantic coast storms but still maintaining the dignified bearing that had originally marked it as the residence of a prominent shipping merchant. Detective Captain Amanda Foster had worked within these walls for nearly 18 years, long enough to understand that the building itself had become a repository of stories that extended far beyond the cases documented in its filing systems. On this October evening, Foster sat in her office on the second floor, surrounded by case files that represented 3 months of investigative work into a series of incidents that had puzzled both her department and the community they served. The cases seemed unrelated at first glance: a missing person report, several instances of vandalism, a suspicious fire, and a series of anonymous letters that had been delivered to various residents throughout the Riverside neighborhood. The missing person case had been the first to cross Foster's desk, filed by Margaret Hastings when her elderly neighbor, Dr. Edward Thornfield, had failed to appear for their weekly chess game at the Riverside Community Library. Dr. Thornfield, age 73, had maintained the same routine for nearly 5 years since his retirement from the University Medical School, arriving at the library every Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock precisely to challenge Mrs. Hastings to games that had become the highlight of both their weeks. Mrs. Hastings had waited until 9 o'clock on the evening in question before walking the 4 blocks to Dr. Thornfield's house on Sycamore Avenue, where she had found his front porch light burning and his car in the driveway, but no response to her repeated knocking. The house had appeared normal from the outside, its garden maintained and its windows secure, but something about the quality of silence that surrounded the property had prompted Mrs. Hastings to contact the police rather than assume that Dr. Thornfield had simply forgotten their appointment. Officer Lisa Chun had responded to Mrs. Hastings's call and had conducted a preliminary investigation that revealed Dr. Thornfield's absence, but no immediate signs of foul play or emergency. The house had been locked securely, with no evidence of forced entry or disturbance. Dr. Thornfield's car showed no signs of recent travel, and his mail had accumulated in the box beside his front door, suggesting that he had been away for several days without making arrangements for mail collection. Chun's initial report had noted the well-maintained condition of Dr. Thornfield's property and the absence of any obvious explanations for his disappearance. His neighbors described him as reliable, methodical, and extremely particular about maintaining his routine. The weekly chess games with Mrs. Hastings were part of a larger pattern of scheduled activities that included grocery shopping on Wednesday mornings, library visits on Friday afternoons, and gardening work on weekends when weather permitted. The investigation had expanded over the following week as Foster's team had attempted to trace Dr. Thornfield's recent activities and identify anyone who might have information about his whereabouts. His medical colleagues at the university described him as a dedicated researcher who had continued working on scholarly projects even after his official retirement. His former students remembered him as demanding but fair, someone who had inspired many young doctors to pursue careers in research and academic medicine. Dr. Thornfield's personal finances were in excellent order, with no evidence of unusual transactions or activities that might explain a sudden departure. His passport remained in his home office, eliminating the possibility of international travel, and his bank accounts showed no large withdrawals or transfers that might suggest planned relocation. His prescription medications remained in his bathroom medicine cabinet, making it unlikely that he had left voluntarily for an extended period. The investigation had taken an unusual turn when Foster's team had discovered Dr. Thornfield's research notebooks, which documented a decades-long study of local environmental conditions and their potential health impacts on community residents. His work had focused particularly on the industrial history of the Riverside neighborhood, where several manufacturing facilities had operated during the mid-20th century before being demolished or converted to other uses. Dr. Thornfield's research had revealed patterns of illness and environmental contamination that had not been widely recognized or officially acknowledged, despite their potential significance for public health and environmental policy. His notebooks contained detailed maps, health statistics, and correspondence with various government agencies that had been unresponsive to his inquiries about environmental monitoring and cleanup responsibilities. The environmental research had led Dr. Thornfield to focus particular attention on a former chemical processing facility that had operated on the banks of the Riverside Creek from 1947 to 1983. The facility had been demolished in the late 1980s, and the site had been converted to a neighborhood park that was popular with families and joggers. But Dr. Thornfield's research suggested that soil and groundwater contamination from the former industrial operations might pose ongoing health risks that had never been properly assessed or addressed. Foster found herself drawn into the complexity of Dr. Thornfield's research, recognizing that his disappearance might be connected to his environmental investigations rather than to personal or criminal factors that typically motivated missing person cases. The notebooks revealed a pattern of official indifference and bureaucratic obstacles that had frustrated Dr. Thornfield's efforts to bring environmental concerns to public attention. The vandalism incidents that had begun occurring shortly before Dr. Thornfield's disappearance had initially seemed unrelated to the missing person case, but Foster's investigation had revealed potential connections that suggested a more complex pattern of harassment and intimidation. The vandalism had targeted several properties in the Riverside neighborhood, including Dr. Thornfield's house, where paint had been thrown on his front door and garden. Tools had been scattered across his lawn. Similar incidents had occurred at the homes of other residents who had been involved in environmental advocacy activities or who had expressed concerns about development plans for the former industrial site. The vandalism appeared calculated to send messages rather than to cause significant property damage, with symbolic elements that suggested knowledge of the victim's activities and concerns. Officer Jennifer Park had investigated the vandalism reports and had documented patterns that indicated planning and coordination rather than random mischief. The incidents had occurred during late evening hours when residents were likely to be at home, but when visibility was limited. The vandals had avoided security cameras and had left no clear evidence of their identities, suggesting familiarity with the neighborhood and careful observation of residents' routines. The anonymous letters that had been delivered throughout the Riverside neighborhood had escalated the pattern of intimidation, containing messages that warned recipients against interfering with progress and spreading false information about safe development projects. The letters had been professionally printed rather than handwritten, suggesting access to commercial printing equipment and careful planning to avoid identification through handwriting. Foster's analysis of the anonymous letters had revealed sophisticated knowledge of local development plans and environmental issues that extended beyond what casual observers might possess. The letters referenced specific zoning proposals, environmental assessments, and regulatory processes that suggested their authors had access to insider information about municipal government and private development activities. The suspicious fire that had occurred at the Riverside Community Library had destroyed the local history section where Dr. Thornfield had conducted much of his research, including materials that had documented the industrial history of the neighborhood and the health impacts of environmental contamination. The fire had been ruled accidental by the fire department, but the timing and location had raised questions about whether the incident had been intended to Eliminate specific documents and research materials. Foster's investigation of the library. Fire had revealed that the blaze had started in the basement storage area where historical documents and archived materials were kept in conditions that made accidental ignition unlikely. The fire had spread rapidly through the history section before being contained by the sprinkler system, but not before destroying irreplaceable documents and photographs that had documented decades of local history. The library's director, Susan Martinez, had been devastated by the loss of historical materials that had been donated by families and organizations throughout the community. The destroyed documents had included corporate records from defunct industries, photographs of neighborhood development, and personal papers that had provided unique insights into the social and economic history of the area. Dr. Thornfield had been a regular user of the library's historical collection, and Martinez confirmed that he had been researching industrial records and environmental documentation in the weeks before his disappearance. His research had focused particularly on documents related to the former chemical processing facility and the regulatory processes that had governed its operations and eventual closure. The destruction of these research materials had eliminated much of the documentary evidence that Dr. Thornfield had been using to support his environmental investigations, potentially undermining his ability to document contamination concerns or to advocate for proper environmental assessment and cleanup. The timing of the fire suggested that it might have been intended to disrupt his research rather than being truly accidental. Foster's investigation had expanded to include examination of current development plans for the Riverside neighborhood, revealing proposals for large-scale residential and commercial construction that would significantly increase the economic value of properties in the area. The development plans had generated controversy among existing residents, with some supporting economic growth and others expressing concerns about environmental impacts and changes to neighborhood character. The development proposals included plans for luxury condominiums, shopping centers, and recreational facilities that would transform the quiet residential character of the Riverside neighborhood into a more intensive, mixed-use area. The projects represented significant financial investments that would benefit property developers, construction companies, and municipal government through increased tax revenues, but the development plans had not adequately addressed environmental concerns that Dr. Thornfield's research had identified, particularly regarding potential soil and groundwater contamination from former industrial operations. The environmental assessments required for development permits had been conducted by consulting firms with potential conflicts of interest, and the results had not been made available for independent review by community members or environmental advocates. Foster's investigation had revealed connections between the development companies proposing Riverside projects and the consulting firms that had conducted environmental assessments, suggesting potential conflicts of interest that might have influenced the conclusions about environmental safety and development feasibility. The relationships raised questions about whether environmental concerns were being adequately evaluated and addressed through official regulatory processes. The pattern of harassment and intimidation that had affected Dr. Thornfield and other environmental advocates appeared designed to discourage public scrutiny of development plans and environmental assessments that might reveal problems or raise questions about project safety and appropriateness. The missing person case had evolved into an investigation of potential corruption and environmental crime that extended far beyond individual criminal acts. Foster found herself navigating complex relationships between municipal government, private development interests, and community concerns that had created incentives for suppressing environmental information and silencing advocates who might interfere with profitable development projects. The investigation required careful attention to political sensitivities while maintaining focus on criminal activities that might have motivated Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. The search for Dr. Thornfield had expanded to include examination of locations where he might have been taken if his disappearance involved kidnapping or other criminal activity. Foster's team had conducted extensive searches of abandoned buildings, remote areas, and former industrial sites where evidence might be concealed or where individuals might be held against their will. The searches had revealed several locations with signs of recent activity that could not be explained by legitimate uses, including abandoned buildings where surveillance equipment had been installed and remote areas where vehicles had been parked for extended periods. These discoveries suggested ongoing activities that might be connected to the harassment campaign, targeting environmental advocates. One particularly significant discovery had been made at the site of the former chemical processing facility, where ground-penetrating radar had detected underground storage areas that had not been included in environmental assessments or demolition records. The hidden structures suggested that facility closure and cleanup had been incomplete, potentially leaving contaminated materials and equipment that posed ongoing environmental and health risks. Discovery of concealed contamination at the former industrial site had provided potential explanations for the harassment campaign, targeting Dr. Thornfield and other environmental advocates. If development projects proceeded without proper environmental assessment and cleanup, the hidden contamination could create significant legal and financial liabilities for developers, contractors, and municipal officials who had approved construction permits. Foster's investigation had attracted attention from federal environmental agencies and state law enforcement officials who had expertise in environmental crime and corruption cases. The complexity of the investigation required coordination between multiple agencies and careful management of jurisdictional issues that arose when local criminal activity intersected with federal environmental and corruption statutes. Federal involvement had provided additional resources and expertise while also creating political pressures that complicated Foster's efforts to maintain focus on Dr. Thornfield's disappearance and the local criminal activities that had preceded it. The case had evolved from a routine missing person investigation into a complex examination of environmental crime, political corruption, and the intersection of private financial interests with public environmental responsibilities. As Foster reviewed the accumulated evidence from 3 months of investigation, she recognized that Dr. Thornfield's disappearance represented more than an individual crime, but reflected broader conflicts over environmental protection, community development, and the responsibilities of public officials to protect citizens from environmental hazards and private exploitation. The case had revealed systematic efforts to suppress environmental information, intimidate advocates, and manipulate regulatory processes in ways that threaten both individual safety and community welfare. Dr. Thornfield's research had documented environmental problems that required attention and cleanup, but his advocacy had apparently threatened financial interests powerful enough to motivate criminal activity designed to silence him. The rain continued falling against Foster's office windows as she prepared her evening report, the steady rhythm providing a counterpoint to the complexity of the investigation that had consumed her attention for months. The weather reminded her of the natural cycles that continued regardless of human conflicts, the eternal processes of renewal and change that would eventually resolve all current controversies through the simple passage of time. But time was a luxury that Dr. Thornfield might not possess, and Foster understood that her investigation represented more than professional responsibility, but a commitment to protecting individuals who risked their safety to advocate for community welfare and environmental protection. The missing person case had become a test of whether law enforcement could effectively respond to sophisticated criminal activities that operated through intimidation and corruption. Rather than direct violence, the building around Foster had settled into its evening quiet, with most day shift personnel having departed and only essential overnight operations maintaining activity in other parts of the facility. The Victorian mansion's thick walls and high ceilings created an atmosphere of institutional permanence that provided comfort during complex investigations that challenged both professional skills and personal commitment to justice. Foster gathered her files and prepared to continue the investigation through another evening of patient analysis and careful coordination with other agencies that shared responsibility for environmental protection and criminal justice. Dr. Thornfield's disappearance remained unsolved, but the investigation had revealed patterns and connections that might eventually lead to answers and accountability. The old building held the memory of decades of similar investigations, cases where patient police work had eventually revealed truths that powerful interests had tried to conceal. Foster took comfort in this institutional memory as she prepared for another night of work on a case that tested both her professional skills and her commitment to protecting community members who lacked the resources to protect themselves from sophisticated criminal enterprises. As the rain continued its gentle rhythm against the windows, Foster reflected on the way that environmental crimes operated differently from conventional criminal activities, using bureaucratic processes and legal technicalities to achieve results that direct violence might not accomplish. The investigation required different skills and approaches than those needed for typical police work, but the fundamental commitment to protecting victims and achieving justice remained unchanged. Evening stretched ahead with the promise of continued work on a case that had revealed the complex relationships between environmental protection, community development, and criminal justice that would define much of 21st century police work. Foster prepared to immerse herself once again in the patient analysis and careful investigation that might eventually bring Dr. Thornfield home and hold accountable those who had threatened him for advocating environmental protection and community welfare. Asterisk. Detective Sergeant Michael Torres had learned during his 12 years with the Westfield Police Department that the most important information often came not from what witnesses said directly, but from the pauses between their words, the glances toward windows, and the way their hands moved restlessly as they tried to explain events that had left them feeling uncertain about their own perceptions. On this November morning, Torres sat in the sunny kitchen of Eleanor Blackwood's house on Maple Lane, drinking coffee that she had insisted on preparing despite his protests that the interview was purely routine. Mrs. Blackwood, 78 years old and a resident of the Riverside neighborhood for over 40 years, had called the police 3 days earlier to report what she described as unusual activities in the vacant lot behind her house. Activities that had begun shortly before Dr. Thornfield's disappearance and had continued intermittently during the weeks that followed. Her initial report had been logged as a routine disturbance complaint, but Torres's review of the case files had identified her observations as potentially significant to the missing person investigation. The vacant lot that Mrs. Blackwood could observe from her kitchen window had been the site of a small manufacturing facility during the 1960s and early 1970s, a metal plating operation that had closed when environmental regulations made its continued operation economically unfeasible. The building had been demolished in 1978, leaving behind a quarter-acre of cleared land that had never been redeveloped. Despite its location in an otherwise densely populated residential area, Mrs. Blackwood's observations had begun on a Tuesday, evening in early October, when she had noticed a van parked in the vacant lot during hours when no legitimate activity would normally occur. The van had appeared to be conducting some form of soil testing or environmental sampling, with individuals in protective clothing using equipment that Mrs. Blackwood could not identify, but that appeared to be taking measurements and collecting samples from various locations. Throughout the lot, Torres took careful notes as Mrs. Blackwood described the activities she had witnessed, noting her attention to details and her clear recollection of dates and times despite her advanced age. Her description of the sampling activities suggested professional environmental testing rather than casual exploration, with systematic coverage of the lot and careful handling of collected materials that indicated familiarity with proper scientific procedures. The van had returned to the lot on several occasions during the following weeks, always during evening hours when visibility was limited, but when Mrs. Blackwood's kitchen window provided a clear view of the activities. She had observed the same systematic approach to sampling, with team members working in coordinated fashion and using equipment that appeared to be sophisticated and EXPENSI-VE. Mrs. Blackwood had initially assumed that the sampling activities were being conducted by municipal environmental officials or by consultants working for potential developers who might be interested in purchasing the lot for future construction. But her calls to the city planning department had revealed no record of environmental assessments or development proposals for the property, suggesting that the activities were being conducted without official authorization or oversight. The unofficial nature of the environmental testing had prompted Mrs. Blackwood to pay closer attention to the activities and to document what she observed through photographs taken with a camera that her grandson had given her for her birthday. The photographs, which she shared with Torres during their interview, showed individuals in protective suits working with soil sampling equipment and portable testing devices that appeared to be commercially manufactured and professionally operated. Torres examined the photographs carefully, noting details that Mrs. Blackwood might not have recognized as significant, but that suggested the environmental testing was being conducted by individuals with specialized training and access to expensive equipment. The systematic nature of the sampling and the professional appearance of the equipment indicated that the work was being funded by organizations with substantial financial resources and specific interest in the environmental conditions of the former industrial site. Mrs. Blackwood's photographs had also captured vehicle license plates and equipment markings that Torres could use to identify the companies or organizations responsible for the unofficial environmental testing. His preliminary investigation had revealed that the van was registered to Coastal Environmental Services, a consulting firm that specialized in environmental assessments for development projects and industrial operations. The connection to Coastal Environmental Services had provided Torres with his first concrete lead in understanding the activities that Mrs. Blackwood had observed and their potential relationship to Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. Coastal Environmental was owned by Dr. Patricia Hoffman, a former university colleague of Dr. Thornfield, who had left academic research to establish a private consulting practice that served commercial clients throughout the Atlantic Coast region. Torres's interview with Dr. Hoffman had been scheduled for later that morning, but his conversation with Mrs. Blackwood had provided valuable background information that would help him ask informed questions about the unofficial environmental testing and its potential connection to broader patterns of activity in the Riverside neighborhood. The second witness interview on Torres's schedule was with James Morrison, a retired postal worker who had delivered mail to the Riverside neighborhood for over 20 years before his retirement in 2019. Morrison had contacted the police department after reading newspaper coverage of Dr. Thornfield's disappearance, offering information about unusual mail delivery patterns that he had observed during his final years of postal service. Asterisk. Torres met Morrison at the Riverside Coffee House, a small establishment that served as an informal community center where neighborhood residents gathered to share information and discuss local issues. The coffee house occupied a converted residential building that had been carefully renovated to preserve its historic character while providing modern amenities that made it a comfortable meeting place for people of all ages. Morrison's information concerned changes in mail delivery patterns that had begun approximately 2 years before Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. Changes that had initially seemed routine, but that had taken on different significance in light of recent events. Several residents in the Riverside neighborhood had begun receiving increased volumes of mail from legal firms, environmental consulting companies, and real estate development organizations. Mail that suggested coordinated efforts to influence local opinion about development, proposals, and environmental issues. The mail delivery patterns that Morrison described indicated systematic campaigns to provide residents with information that supported specific perspectives on development projects while minimizing exposure to alternative viewpoints or critical analysis. The materials had been professionally produced and had arrived according to schedules that suggested careful planning and substantial financial investment in influencing community opinion. Morrison had also observed increased delivery of certified mail and legal documents to residents who had been active in environmental advocacy or who had expressed concerns about development proposals. The legal mail had included property surveys, zoning notifications, and other documents that suggested efforts to use regulatory processes and legal procedures to influence or intimidate residents who might oppose development projects. Asterisk. Dr. Thornfield had been among the residents who had received increased volumes of legal mail during the months before his disappearance. According to Morrison's recollections, the mail had included documents from law firms representing development companies, environmental consulting reports that supported development proposals, and notifications about zoning, hearings, and regulatory proceedings that might affect neighborhood development plans. Torres's notes from his conversation with Morrison revealed patterns of information management and potential intimidation that extended beyond Dr. Thornfield's individual case to encompass broader efforts to influence community opinion and suppress opposition to development projects. The mail delivery pattern suggested coordinated campaigns that combined information dissemination with legal intimidation to achieve compliance with development objectives. The third witness interview that Torres had scheduled for that day was with Dr. Sarah Kim, an environmental health specialist at the Regional Medical Center who had worked with Dr. Thornfield on several research projects over the years. Dr. Kim had contacted the police department after learning about her colleague's disappearance, offering to provide information about his recent research activities and his concerns about environmental health issues in the Riverside neighborhood. Torres met Dr. Kim at her office in the medical center, where she had access to research files and correspondence that documented her collaboration with Dr. Thornfield on studies of environmental contamination and community health impacts. Their research partnership had focused particularly on identifying connections between industrial pollution and health problems that might not be immediately apparent, but that could have significant long-term consequences for community residents. Dr. Kim's research files contained detailed health statistics and environmental data that supported Dr. Thornfield's concerns about contamination from former industrial operations in the Riverside neighborhood. Their collaborative work had documented elevated rates of certain cancers and respiratory diseases among long-term residents of the area, patterns that suggested ongoing exposure to environmental hazards, despite the closure of industrial facilities decades earlier. The health data that Dr. Kim shared with Torres provided scientific support for Dr. Thornfield's environmental advocacy and demonstrated the potential significance of his research for public health policy and environmental regulation. The evidence of health impacts strengthened arguments for comprehensive environmental assessment and cleanup of former industrial sites before they were approved for residential or commercial development. Dr. Kim had also received threatening communications, similar to those that had been delivered to other environmental advocates in the Riverside neighborhood. Communications that had escalated in frequency and intensity during the months before Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. The threats had been carefully worded to avoid explicit criminal content, while conveying clear messages about the potential consequences of continued environmental advocacy. The threatening communications had been designed to create fear and uncertainty without providing clear evidence of criminal intent that could be prosecuted effectively through conventional legal channels. The psychological intimidation reflected sophisticated understanding of legal limitations and demonstrated careful planning to achieve maximum intimidating effect while minimizing legal risk for the perpetrators. Torres's fourth witness interview was with Benjamin Rodriguez, a local contractor who had worked on several development projects in the Riverside neighborhood and who had observed unusual activities at construction sites that might be relevant to the investigation. Rodriguez had contacted police after recognizing Dr. Thornfield's photograph in newspaper coverage and remembering conversations they had had about environmental concerns at various construction sites. Rodriguez met Torres at a construction site where he was supervising renovation work on a historic building that was being converted to luxury condominiums. The location provided a concrete example of the development pressures that were transforming the Riverside neighborhood, while also illustrating the construction practices that had concerned Dr. Thornfield and other environmental advocates. The construction work that Rodriguez supervised required careful attention to environmental safety because of potential contamination from previous industrial uses of the building and surrounding property. Rodriguez had implemented safety procedures that exceeded minimum regulatory requirements because of concerns about worker safety and long-term environmental impacts that might affect future residents of the converted building. Rodriguez's observations of other construction projects in the neighborhood had revealed variations in environmental safety practices that suggested different levels of commitment to protecting workers and future residents from environmental hazards. Some contractors had implemented comprehensive safety measures, while others had appeared to meet only minimum regulatory requirements, creating potential disparities in environmental protection across different development projects. Dr. Thornfield had visited several construction sites to discuss environmental concerns with contractors and workers, according to Rodriguez's recollections. His conversations had focused on soil contamination, air quality monitoring, and proper disposal procedures for materials that might contain industrial pollutants from previous uses of development sites. The construction industry's response to Dr. Thornfield's environmental advocacy had varied significantly, with some contractors welcoming his expertise and recommendations, while others had been resistant to suggestions that might increase project costs or delay construction schedules. The economic pressures associated with development projects had created incentives for minimizing environmental protection measures despite potential long-term consequences for community health and safety. Torres's fifth witness interview was with Margaret Flynn, a librarian at the Riverside Community Library who had worked closely with Dr. Thornfield on his historical research and who had been present during the fire that had destroyed much of the library's local history collection. Flynn had been working late on the evening of the fire and had been among the first to discover the blaze and call for emergency assistance. Flynn's account of the library fire revealed details that had not been included in official fire department reports. Details that suggested the possibility of deliberate arson rather than accidental ignition. Her observations of the fire's origin and spread patterns differed from conclusions reached by fire investigators, raising questions about whether the investigation had been thorough enough to eliminate arson as a possible cause. The timing and location of the fire had been particularly suspicious given Dr. Thornfield's extensive use of the destroyed historical materials and the potential significance of those documents for his environmental research. The fire had eliminated irreplaceable evidence that might have supported Dr. Thornfield's advocacy for environmental assessment and cleanup of former industrial sites. Flynn had also observed unusual activities in the library during the weeks before the fire, including visits by individuals who had requested access to the same historical documents that Dr. Thornfield had been researching. The visitors had claimed to be conducting academic research, but their questions and behavior had suggested different motivations that Flynn had found concerning the destruction of historical documents, and the library fire had eliminated much of the documentary evidence that supported Dr. Thornfield's environmental concerns, potentially undermining his ability to advocate effectively for environmental protection and community health. The loss of irreplaceable historical materials had created gaps in the community's collective memory that might benefit those who preferred to avoid scrutiny of past industrial practices and their ongoing environmental consequences. Torres's sixth witness interview was with Detective Lisa Park, his colleague who had been investigating the vandalism incidents that had occurred throughout the Riverside neighborhood in the weeks before and after Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. Park had identified patterns in the vandalism that suggested coordination and planning rather than random criminal activity. Park's investigation had revealed that the vandalism had targeted specifically those residents who had been involved in environmental advocacy or who had expressed concerns about development proposals for former industrial sites. The selective targeting suggested that the perpetrators possessed detailed knowledge of community politics and individual residents' positions on environmental and development issues. The vandalism had been designed to send intimidating messages, while avoiding the kind of serious property damage that might prompt more intensive police investigation or community mobilization. The careful calibration of the harassment suggested sophisticated planning and understanding of the psychological impacts that different types of intimidation might have on various community members. Park had also identified connections between the vandalism incidents and other forms of harassment that had affected environmental advocates throughout the region, suggesting that the Riverside neighborhood activities were part of a broader campaign to suppress environmental advocacy and facilitate development projects that might not survive intensive environmental scrutiny. The coordination of harassment activities across multiple communities indicated substantial financial resources and sophisticated organization that extended far beyond local criminal activity to encompass regional or even national efforts to influence environmental policy and development practices through intimidation and suppression of advocacy. Torres's seventh witness interview was with Thomas Chun, a private investigator who had been hired by Dr. Thornfield several months before his disappearance to conduct research into the corporate relationships and financial interests that might be influencing development proposals in the Riverside neighborhood. Chun had agreed to share his findings with police in the hope that his research might provide leads relevant to the missing person investigation. Chun's investigation had revealed complex networks of financial relationships connecting development companies, environmental consulting firms, and municipal officials who were responsible for approving development permits and environmental assessments. The relationship suggested potential conflicts of interest that might influence regulatory decisions in ways that favored development interests over environmental protection and community welfare. The private investigator's research had documented campaign contributions, consulting contracts, and business relationships that created financial incentives for municipal officials to approve development projects without requiring comprehensive environmental assessment or cleanup of contaminated sites. The influence networks that Chun had identified provided potential explanations for regulatory failures that had concerned Dr. Thornfield and other environmental advocates. Chun had also discovered evidence of surveillance activities directed against environmental advocates, surveillance that appeared to be conducted by private security firms working for development companies or related interests. The surveillance had included monitoring of public meetings, tracking of individual advocates' activities, and collection of personal information that could be used for intimidation or harassment purposes. The surveillance activities that Chun had documented suggested sophisticated efforts to gather intelligence about environmental advocacy activities and to identify individuals who might pose threats to development interests. The intelligence gathering had apparently been used to coordinate harassment campaigns and intimidation efforts designed to discourage environmental advocacy and community organizing. Torres's final witness interview of the day was with Dr. Maria Santos, an environmental lawyer who had been advising Dr. Thornfield about legal strategies for compelling proper environmental assessment and cleanup of former industrial sites. Dr. Santos had received threatening communications similar to those delivered to other advocates, and she had noticed increased scrutiny of her professional activities by regulatory agencies and professional organizations. Dr. Santos's legal analysis had identified multiple violations of environmental law and regulatory procedure that had occurred in connection with development approvals for former industrial sites in the Riverside neighborhood. The violations included inadequate environmental assessment, failure to require proper cleanup of contaminated sites, and approval of development permits without adequate public notice or opportunity for community input. The legal violations that Dr. Santos had documented provided potential grounds for litigation that could delay or prevent development projects while requiring comprehensive environmental assessment and cleanup. The threat of successful legal challenges had apparently motivated efforts to intimidate and silence Dr. Santos and her clients, including Dr. Thornfield. The pattern of intimidation directed against environmental lawyers suggested recognition that legal advocacy represented a significant threat to development interests that were seeking to avoid environmental compliance costs and regulatory delays. The harassment of legal professionals indicated sophisticated understanding of the regulatory process and the potential impact of effective legal advocacy on development projects. As Torres completed his witness interviews and prepared his summary reports, he recognized that the investigation had revealed systematic efforts to suppress environmental advocacy through harassment, intimidation, and potential violence. Dr. Thornfield's disappearance appeared to be connected to broader patterns of criminal activity designed to protect development interests from environmental scrutiny and regulatory compliance. The witness statements that Torres had collected provided evidence of coordination and planning that extended far beyond individual criminal acts to encompass organized efforts to influence environmental policy and development practices through intimidation and suppression of advocacy. The investigation had revealed potential connections to corruption, environmental crime, and conspiracy that required careful analysis and coordination with federal law enforcement agencies. The evening light filtered through the windows of the police station as Torres organized his notes and prepared to brief Detective Captain Foster about the information he had gathered through his witness interviews. The careful work of collecting testimony had revealed patterns and connections that transformed the missing person investigation into a complex examination of environmental crime and corruption that challenged both local law enforcement capabilities and community efforts to protect environmental health and safety. The witness statements would become crucial evidence in understanding not only Dr. Thornfield's disappearance, but also the broader criminal enterprise that had apparently targeted environmental advocates throughout the region. The patient work of listening to community members and documenting their observations had revealed a sophisticated criminal conspiracy that used legal intimidation, psychological harassment, and potential violence to suppress environmental advocacy and facilitate profitable development projects regardless of their environmental and health consequences. The forensics laboratory occupied the entire third floor of the Bay Westfield Police Department, its sterile corridors and specialized workstations creating an environment where science transformed physical materials into legal evidence through careful analysis and meticulous documentation. Evidence technician Dr. Rachel Morrison had supervised the laboratory for nearly 15 years, during which time she had developed an almost mystical appreciation for the way that inanimate objects could preserve and reveal human activities long after the events themselves had passed into memory. On this December morning, Dr. Morrison moved through the laboratory's various sections with the deliberate pace that characterized all forensic work, checking on analyses that had been running overnight and preparing equipment for the day's examination of evidence collected in connection with Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. The case had generated an unusual volume of physical evidence, much of it requiring sophisticated analysis techniques that could reveal information invisible to casual observation. The soil samples that had been collected from the vacant lot behind Mrs. Blackwood's house occupied an entire section of the chemistry laboratory, their analysis requiring weeks of careful testing to identify contaminants and determine their sources. Dr. Morrison had supervised the collection personally, using sterile techniques that ensured the integrity of samples while preserving any trace evidence that might be present. In the soil matrix, the preliminary analysis of the soil samples had revealed elevated concentrations of heavy metals and organic compounds that indicated contamination from industrial activities. Contamination that was consistent with the former metal plating operation that had operated on the site during the 1960s and 1970s. But the analysis had also revealed more recent contamination that suggested ongoing activities that were introducing new pollutants into the soil despite the site's current status as vacant land. Dr. Morrison examined the chromatography results that showed the chemical signatures of the recent contamination, noting patterns that indicated specific industrial processes and chemical compounds that could be traced to their sources through comparison with reference databases. The chemical analysis provided a forensic fingerprint that might identify the organizations responsible for the recent contamination and establish connections to Dr. Thornfield's environmental research. The spectroscopy analysis of the soil samples had revealed trace amounts of rare earth elements and specialized chemicals that were used primarily in electronics manufacturing and advanced materials processing. The presence of these substances suggested that the recent contamination was not related to the former metal plating operation, but was instead connected to more contemporary industrial activities that were not being conducted openly at the site. The sophisticated chemistry revealed by the soil analysis indicated that unauthorized industrial activities were being conducted at the vacant lot site, activities that might explain the unofficial environmental testing that Mrs. Blackwood had observed, and the efforts to intimidate residents who might discover or report the illegal operations. The physical evidence provided scientific support for theories about criminal activity that extended far beyond Dr. Thornfield's individual disappearance. Dr. Morrison's analysis of paint samples collected from the vandalism incidents had revealed manufacturing signatures that could be traced to specific paint, brands and retail outlets, information that might help identify the perpetrators through surveillance footage or purchase records. The paint analysis had also revealed mixing patterns that suggested the vandalism had been conducted by multiple individuals using paint from the same source, indicating coordination and planning rather than random criminal activity. The fiber analysis section of the laboratory contains samples collected from Dr. Thornfield's house and vehicle. Fibers that might have been deposited by individuals who had been in contact with him around the time of his disappearance. Dr. Morrison used high-powered microscopy to examine the fiber samples, comparing their characteristics with reference collections that could identify their sources and manufacturing origins. The fiber evidence had revealed synthetic materials that were not consistent with Dr. Thornfield's normal clothing or household textiles, suggesting contact with individuals who wore specialized protective clothing or uniforms. The synthetic fibers showed characteristics consistent with industrial safety equipment, including chemical-resistant materials and anti-static fabrics that were used primarily in hazardous materials handling and electronic manufacturing operations. The presence of specialized synthetic fibers in Dr. Thornfield's home and vehicle suggested that he had been in contact with individuals involved in industrial activities that required protective equipment, contact that might have been related to his environmental research or that might have occurred during the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. The fiber evidence provided physical links between Dr. Thornfield and industrial operations that were not immediately apparent from other aspects of the investigation. Dr. Morrison's examination of fingerprint evidence had revealed partial prints on surfaces throughout Dr. Thornfield's house that were not consistent with his own prints or those of known visitors such as Mrs. Hastings or cleaning personnel. The unknown fingerprints had been entered into national databases for comparison, but no matches had been found, suggesting that the individuals responsible were not in the criminal justice system or had never been fingerprinted for employment or licensing purposes. The fingerprint analysis had revealed multiple unknown individuals who had been present in Dr. Thornfield's house, individuals who had touched surfaces throughout the residence in patterns that suggested systematic searching rather than casual presence. The distribution of unknown fingerprints indicated that the searchers had been looking for specific items or documents rather than conducting random burglary or vandalism. The digital forensics section of the laboratory had been examining Dr. Thornfield's computer equipment and electronic devices to recover data that might provide information about his recent activities, communications, and research. Dr. Morrison worked closely with digital forensics specialist Thomas Liu to coordinate the analysis of electronic evidence with the examination of physical materials that might be related to digital activities. The computer analysis had revealed that Dr. Thornfield's research files had been accessed and copied during the weeks before his disappearance, copying that had been conducted using sophisticated techniques that were designed to avoid detection through normal computer security measures. The unauthorized access suggested that individuals with advanced technical skills had been monitoring Dr. Thornfield's research and possibly stealing his data for use by competing interests. Electronic evidence had also revealed attempted intrusions into Dr. Thornfield's email accounts and online storage systems, intrusions that had been partially successful in accessing his correspondence with other environmental advocates and legal advisors. The attempted data theft indicated that Dr. Thornfield's communications were being monitored as part of broader intelligence gathering activities directed against environmental advocacy organizations. Dr. Morrison's analysis of DNA evidence collected from Dr. Thornfield's house and vehicle had revealed genetic material from multiple unknown individuals. Material that had been preserved despite apparent efforts to clean surfaces and eliminate forensic evidence. The DNA analysis required careful comparison with elimination samples from known visitors to identify genetic material that might have been deposited by individuals connected to Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. The DNA evidence included both nuclear DNA that could provide individual identification and mitochondrial DNA that could provide information about maternal lineages and geographic origins. The analysis had revealed genetic markers that suggested the unknown individuals included people of diverse ethnic backgrounds. Information that might help narrow the investigation by focusing on organizations or groups that employed people with specific demographic characteristics. Trace evidence analysis section contained microscopic materials that had been collected from Dr. Thornfield's clothing, vehicle, and personal effects, materials that might provide information about locations he had visited or activities he had engaged in during the period before his disappearance. Dr. Morrison used electron microscopy to examine trace materials that were invisible to naked eye observation, but that could provide crucial information about Dr. Thornfield's final movements. The trace evidence analysis had revealed particles of specialized concrete that was used primarily in industrial construction and hazardous materials containment. Concrete that was not commonly found in residential or commercial settings. The presence of industrial concrete particles on Dr. Thornfield's clothing suggested that he had visited industrial facilities or construction sites where such materials were being used. Visits that might have been related to his environmental research or that might have occurred during the circumstances of his disappearance. Concrete particles showed chemical signatures that could be traced to specific manufacturers and suppliers. Information that might help identify the locations where Dr. Thornfield had been present before his disappearance. The forensic analysis of trace materials provided a timeline of activities that could be reconstructed through careful examination of microscopic evidence that preserved information about human movements and activities. Dr. Morrison's analysis of photographic evidence had involved both enhancement of images to reveal details that were not visible in original photographs, and chemical analysis of photographic materials to determine their sources and processing history. The photographic evidence included images taken by Mrs. Blackwood of the unauthorized environmental testing and surveillance photographs that had been discovered during searches of suspected surveillance locations. Photographic analysis had revealed that some of the surveillance images had been taken with specialized equipment that was typically used for industrial or military applications rather than civilian photography. The technical characteristics of the photographs suggested that the surveillance activities had been conducted by individuals with access to professional or governmental surveillance equipment, indicating more sophisticated organization than typical private investigation or corporate security operations. The chemical analysis of photographic materials had revealed processing chemicals and paper types that could be traced to specific suppliers and geographical regions, information that might help identify the organizations responsible for the surveillance activities. The forensic examination of photographs provided evidence of the scope and sophistication of surveillance operations that had been directed against Dr. Thornfield and other environmental advocates. Ballistics section of the laboratory had examined ammunition and weapons that had been discovered during searches of suspected criminal locations. Ammunition that might be connected to threats or violence directed against environmental advocates. Dr. Morrison coordinated the ballistics analysis with other forensic examinations to determine whether physical evidence supported theories about criminal activities that might have motivated Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. The ballistics analysis had revealed ammunition types that were used primarily for hunting and sport shooting, but also included specialized rounds that were designed for professional or tactical applications. The presence of tactical ammunition suggested that some of the individuals involved in activities related to Dr. Thornfield's case had access to military or law enforcement equipment, indicating potential connections to governmental or security organizations. The firearms examination had revealed weapons modifications and maintenance practices that suggested professional training and experience with specialized equipment. The technical characteristics of the weapons provided information about the backgrounds and capabilities of individuals who might have been involved in threatening or harming environmental advocates, information that could help focus the investigation on specific types of organizations or groups. Dr. Morrison's examination of document evidence had involved both physical analysis of papers and inks and content analysis of written materials that had been collected during the investigation. The document analysis required coordination between forensic science techniques and investigative analysis to determine both the authenticity of documents and their significance for understanding criminal activities. The paper and ink analysis had revealed that some of the threatening letters received by environmental advocates had been produced using commercial printing equipment and professional-grade materials, indicating access to sophisticated printing facilities rather than simple desktop publishing equipment. The technical analysis of printed materials provided information about the resources and capabilities of the organizations responsible for intimidation campaigns. The content analysis of documents had revealed patterns of language and information that suggested coordination between different threatening communications, coordination that indicated centralized planning and distribution of intimidation materials. The linguistic analysis provided evidence of organized criminal activity rather than independent harassment by individual actors. The environmental analysis section of the laboratory had been examining air and water samples collected from locations throughout the Riverside neighborhood to determine the extent and sources of contamination that had concerned Dr. Thornfield and other environmental advocates. Dr. Morrison supervised the environmental testing to ensure that forensic standards were maintained while addressing public health concerns that extended beyond criminal investigation. The air quality analysis had revealed elevated concentrations of volatile organic compounds and particulate matter that indicated ongoing contamination sources despite the absence of obvious industrial activities in the neighborhood. The contamination patterns suggested that unauthorized industrial operations were being conducted at concealed locations, operations that might be connected to the criminal activities that had targeted environmental advocates. The water quality analysis had revealed contamination of groundwater and surface water that exceeded safe drinking water standards and environmental protection guidelines. The contamination included industrial chemicals and heavy metals that were consistent with the historical industrial activities, but also included newer contaminants that suggested ongoing pollution, sources that were not being monitored or regulated through official channels. The environmental forensics had provided scientific evidence that supported Dr. Thornfield's concerns about ongoing environmental contamination and public health risks, evidence that strengthened arguments for comprehensive environmental assessment and cleanup while also providing potential motives for criminal activities designed to prevent environmental advocacy and regulatory enforcement. Dr. Morrison's coordination of the various forensic analyses had revealed patterns and connections that transformed individual pieces of physical evidence into a comprehensive picture of criminal activities that extended far beyond Dr. Thornfield's personal disappearance. The forensic evidence supported theories about organized criminal enterprises that used intimidation, surveillance, and potentially violence to protect illegal industrial operations and prevent environmental regulatory enforcement. The scientific analysis of physical evidence had provided objective information that corroborated witness statements and investigative theories, while also revealing new information that had not been apparent from other aspects of the investigation. The forensic work had transformed speculation and suspicion into documented facts that could support prosecution efforts and policy responses to environmental crime and corruption. As Dr. Morrison prepared her comprehensive forensic report for Detective Captain Foster, she reflected on the way that physical evidence preserved information about human activities long after the events themselves had passed into memory. The microscopic traces, chemical signatures, and genetic markers that she had analyzed in her laboratory would provide permanent records of criminal activities that could not be destroyed through intimidation or corruption. The forensic evidence would serve not only as support for criminal prosecution, but also as scientific documentation of environmental contamination and public health risks that required attention regardless of the outcome of the criminal investigation. The careful analysis of physical materials had revealed truths that could not be suppressed through violence or intimidation. Truths that would persist as long as scientific standards and forensic integrity were maintained. The late afternoon light filtered through the laboratory windows as Dr. Morrison completed her analysis and prepared to brief the investigation team about her findings. The forensic work had required weeks of patient analysis and careful documentation, but it had provided crucial evidence that advanced understanding of both Dr. Thornfield's disappearance and the broader criminal activities that had apparently motivated his targeting by criminal organizations. The physical evidence would speak for Dr. Thornfield, even if he could not speak for himself, preserving in microscopic detail the scientific truth about environmental contamination and criminal activity that had apparently cost him his freedom and possibly his life. The forensic laboratory had become a sanctuary where science protected truth from those who would suppress it through violence and intimidation. Detective Jennifer Walsh had learned during her 8 years with the Westfield Police Department that abandoned buildings possessed their own forms of memory, preserving evidence of human activities long after the people themselves had departed and the official purposes of the structures had been forgotten. On this January morning, Walsh stood before the Riverside Industrial Complex, a collection of empty warehouses and manufacturing buildings that had once employed nearly 1,000 workers, but that had been vacant for over a decade since the last tenant had relocated operations to a more modern facility. The industrial complex occupied 12 acres along the Westfield River, its red brick buildings and steel frame construction representing the architectural optimism of an era when manufacturing had been the willing economic foundation of communities throughout the region. The buildings had been constructed during the 1950s with the expectation that they would serve industrial purposes for generations. Their massive scale and solid construction, creating spaces that could accommodate heavy machinery and intensive production activities. Walsh's investigation of the complex had been prompted by information from the forensic analysis that had identified trace evidence linking Dr. Thornfield to industrial environments, evidence that suggested he had visited manufacturing or storage facilities during the period before his disappearance. The Riverside Industrial Complex was one of several locations that matched the forensic profile, and Walsh had obtained search warrants that allowed her to conduct comprehensive examination of the abandoned buildings. The main warehouse building stretched nearly 300 feet along the riverfront, its high ceilings and concrete floor designed to accommodate large-scale storage and distribution operations. Walsh entered through the loading dock area, where massive overhead doors had once provided access for trucks and railway cars that had transported goods throughout the regional economy. The loading docks were empty now, their concrete platforms weathered by years of exposure to rain and snow that had entered through broken windows and damaged roofing. The interior of the warehouse was divided into sections by steel pillars and concrete walls that had supported the building's structure while providing flexibility for different types of industrial activities. Walsh moved methodically through the empty spaces, using powerful flashlights to illuminate areas where natural light could not penetrate, searching for evidence of recent human activity that might be connected to Dr. Thornfield's disappearance or to the unauthorized industrial operations that the forensic analysis had suggested. The concrete floors of the warehouse showed staining patterns that indicated previous industrial uses, staining that had been created by machinery, chemical spills, and years of heavy traffic from forklifts and other industrial vehicles. But Walsh's careful examination revealed more recent disturbances in the dust and debris that covered the floors. Disturbances that suggested people had been moving through the building despite its officially abandoned status. The recent activity patterns that Walsh documented included footprints in areas where accumulated dust had been disturbed, tire tracks from vehicles that had been driven into the building through damaged loading dock doors, and evidence of temporary lighting systems that had been installed to provide illumination for nighttime activities. The pattern suggested that the abandoned warehouse was being used for purposes that required concealment from casual observation. Walsh's examination of the warehouse's administrative areas revealed office spaces that had been stripped of furniture and equipment, but that retained evidence of recent occupancy. The offices contained document fragments, equipment packaging materials, and other debris that suggested they had been used as temporary operational centers for activities that required coordination and communication capabilities. The document fragments that Walsh collected from the office areas included shipping labels, equipment manuals, and correspondence that referenced environmental testing, soil sampling, and hazardous materials handling. The documentation suggested connections to the unauthorized environmental testing that had been observed in the Riverside neighborhood and to the industrial chemicals that had been identified through forensic analysis of soil samples. The second building in the complex had housed manufacturing operations during its active period, and its interior contained the concrete foundations and utility connections that had supported heavy industrial machinery. Walsh's examination of the manufacturing building revealed evidence of recent equipment installation and operation, evidence that suggested unauthorized industrial activities were being conducted, despite the building's officially abandoned status. The equipment evidence included electrical connections that had been recently installed, compressed air systems that showed signs of recent use, and ventilation modifications that would be necessary for industrial operations involving hazardous materials. The infrastructure improvements suggested substantial investment in restoring the building's operational capabilities for specific industrial purposes that required concealment from regulatory oversight. Walsh's investigation of the manufacturing building's basement areas revealed extensive modifications that had been made to accommodate underground storage and processing activities. The basement modifications included reinforced concrete chambers, specialized drainage systems, and security installations that suggested the space was being used for activities that required both concealment and containment of potentially hazardous materials. The underground facility showed evidence of sophisticated engineering and construction work that would have required significant financial resources and technical expertise. The scale and complexity of the modifications suggested that the unauthorized activities were being conducted by organizations with substantial capabilities and specific technical requirements that could not be met through legitimate industrial facilities. Third building in the complex had been designed for research and development activities, and its interior contained laboratory spaces and specialized rooms that had been equipped with fume hoods, chemical storage systems, and other infrastructure that supported scientific and technical work. Walsh's examination of the laboratory building revealed evidence of recent use that suggested ongoing research and development activities despite the building's abandoned status. The laboratory evidence included chemical residues that were consistent with the industrial compounds that had been identified in soil samples from the Riverside neighborhood, chemical residues that suggested the abandoned laboratory was being used to develop or test processes that were creating environmental contamination. The connection between the laboratory activities and the neighborhood contamination provided potential explanations for the efforts to suppress environmental advocacy and research. Walsh's examination of the laboratory building specialized rooms revealed equipment installations and modifications that supported advanced chemical processing and materials research. The equipment included systems for handling toxic materials, containment facilities for hazardous waste, and monitoring systems that would be necessary for industrial operations that posed significant environmental and health risks. The sophistication of the laboratory facilities suggested that the unauthorized activities involved advanced technical processes that required specialized knowledge and equipment, processes that might be related to military or governmental applications rather than commercial manufacturing. The potential connections to governmental or military activities raised questions about whether Dr. Thornfield's environmental research had uncovered information that posed national security concerns as well as environmental and health risks. The fourth building in the complex contained administrative and conference facilities that had supported the coordination of industrial operations during the complex's active period. Walsh's examination of the administrative building revealed evidence of recent meetings and planning activities that suggested the abandoned facility was serving as a headquarters for coordinating the unauthorized industrial operations and the harassment campaign against environmental advocates. The administrative evidence included meeting notes, planning documents, and communication records that documented systematic efforts to suppress environmental advocacy while protecting unauthorized industrial activities from regulatory discovery and enforcement. The documentation revealed the scope and organization of criminal activities that extended far beyond individual harassment to encompass comprehensive campaigns against environmental protection and regulatory compliance. Walsh's investigation of the administrative building's communication facilities revealed sophisticated equipment for secure communications, data processing, and information management that suggested the unauthorized activities were being coordinated through advanced technological systems. The communication equipment included capabilities for encrypted communications, satellite data transmission, and secure networking that would be necessary for coordinating complex criminal activities across multiple locations and organizations. Technology infrastructure that Walsh discovered in the administrative building suggested that the criminal activities were being supported by organizations with access to governmental or military communication systems, organizations that possessed capabilities far beyond those available to typical criminal enterprises. The advanced technology raised questions about whether the environmental crimes were being committed by or with the knowledge of governmental agencies or military organizations. The complex's transportation infrastructure included railway spurs and truck loading facilities that could support large-scale movement of materials and equipment without attracting attention from casual observers. Walsh's examination of the transportation areas revealed evidence of recent use that suggested the facility was serving as a distribution center for materials and equipment that supported the unauthorized industrial operations. The transportation evidence included tire tracks from specialized vehicles, shipping containers that had been temporarily stored at the facility, and documentation that referenced movement of equipment and materials to locations throughout the region. The evidence suggested that the abandoned complex was serving as a central node in a network of unauthorized industrial activities that extended across multiple states and possibly international boundaries. Walsh's investigation of the complex's security systems revealed sophisticated surveillance and access control equipment that had been installed to protect unauthorized activities from discovery by law enforcement or regulatory agencies. The security systems included motion sensors, surveillance cameras, and communication networks that provided comprehensive monitoring of the facility and its surrounding areas. The security installations suggested that the criminal organizations responsible for the unauthorized activities possessed detailed knowledge of law enforcement and regulatory procedures, knowledge that allowed them to anticipate and counter investigative efforts. The sophistication of the security measures indicated that the criminal activities were being protected by individuals with experience in governmental or military security operations. Environmental impact of the unauthorized activities conducted at the abandoned complex was evident in soil and water contamination that Walsh documented through sampling and testing procedures. The contamination included the same industrial chemicals that had been identified in the Riverside neighborhood, confirming connections between the unauthorized industrial operations and the environmental damage that had concerned Dr. Thornfield and other advocates. The environmental evidence revealed that the abandoned complex was serving as a source of ongoing contamination that posed significant risks to public health and environmental quality throughout the regional watershed. The scale of the contamination suggested that the unauthorized activities had been conducted for extended periods without regulatory oversight or environmental protection measures. Walsh's documentation of the environmental damage provided scientific evidence that supported prosecution of environmental crimes while also demonstrating the significance of Dr. Thornfield's research and advocacy for protecting community health and environmental quality. The evidence validated concerns that had been dismissed or suppressed by regulatory agencies and governmental officials who had failed to investigate reports of environmental contamination. Investigation of the abandoned complex revealed connections to other facilities throughout the region that were being used for similar unauthorized activities, connections that suggested a comprehensive network of environmental crimes that operated across state and national boundaries. The network included facilities for manufacturing, storage, transportation, and disposal of hazardous materials that were being managed outside regulatory oversight and environmental protection requirements. Asterisk. Walsh's investigation had revealed that Dr. Thornfield's environmental research had identified not just local contamination problems but evidence of a regional criminal enterprise that was using abandoned industrial facilities to conduct unauthorized activities that posed significant environmental and health risks. His research had threatened to expose criminal activities that involved substantial financial interests and potentially governmental or military organizations. Abandoned buildings of the Riverside Industrial Complex had preserved evidence of criminal activities that could not be eliminated through intimidation or violence. Evidence that would support prosecution of environmental crimes and corruption while also validating the environmental and health concerns that had motivated Dr. Thornfield's research and advocacy. As Walsh completed her investigation of the complex and prepared her comprehensive report for Detective Captain Foster, she reflected on the way that abandoned buildings could serve, both as repositories of evidence and as concealment for criminal activities. The empty warehouses and manufacturing facilities had provided perfect cover for unauthorized industrial operations while also preserving the evidence that would ultimately expose the criminal enterprise. The investigation of the abandoned complex had revealed the scope and sophistication of criminal activities that had apparently motivated Dr. Thornfield's disappearance, activities that extended far beyond local environmental concerns to encompass regional and potentially national networks of environmental crime and corruption. The empty buildings had held secrets that powerful organizations had been willing to kill to protect, but the physical evidence preserved in concrete and steel could not be silenced through violence or intimidation. The winter afternoon light filtered through the broken windows of the abandoned warehouses as Walsh secured the crime scene and prepared to transport the evidence that would advance the investigation into Dr. Thornfield's disappearance and the criminal enterprise that had targeted him. The empty buildings would continue to stand as silent witnesses to criminal activities that had been conducted in the shadows of legitimate society, their massive structures preserving evidence that would speak for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The abandoned complex represented more than just a crime scene. It embodied the industrial decay that had created opportunities for criminal exploitation while also demonstrating the persistence of physical evidence that could not be destroyed through conventional means. The empty buildings had become a memorial to environmental crime and a repository of evidence that would ensure accountability for those who had profited from contamination and corruption at the expense of community health and environmental protection. Detective Robert Kim had discovered during his decade with the Westfield Police Department that the most significant impact of organized crime often occurred not in dramatic confrontations or violent incidents, but in the quiet erosion of community trust and individual security that happened gradually as people realized that their safety depended on their silence. On this February evening, Kim sat in the comfortable living room of Helen Patterson's house on Oak Street, listening to her describe the subtle campaign of intimidation that had transformed her neighborhood from a place of community pride into a landscape of fearful whispers and drawn curtains. Mrs. Patterson, 64 years old and a retired elementary school teacher, had lived on Oak Street for nearly 30 years, during which time she had served as an informal community leader who organized block parties, coordinated neighborhood watch activities, and helped newcomers integrate into the social fabric that made the Riverside area a desirable place to raise families. Her role as a community connector had made her particularly aware of changes in social dynamics and resident behavior that might not be apparent to casual observers. The changes that Mrs. Patterson described had begun approximately 6 months before Dr. Thornfield's disappearance, starting with subtle alterations in daily routines and social interactions that had gradually intensified into patterns of fear and isolation that affected the entire neighborhood. Residents who had previously been active in community affairs had become reluctant to attend meetings or participate in collective activities, citing vague concerns about privacy and safety that they seemed unable or unwilling to explain in detail. Mrs. Patterson's observations had revealed systematic targeting of community leaders and environmental advocates through harassment techniques that were designed to appear coincidental while creating cumulative psychological pressure that discouraged continued activism and community involvement. The harassment had included anonymous telephone calls, suspicious vehicles parked near homes, and anonymous letters that contained personal information that demonstrated surveillance and investigation of individual residents' activities and relationships. Kim took careful notes as Mrs. Patterson described the psychological impact of the harassment campaign on her neighbors, noting the way that fear had spread through the community despite the absence of overt threats or violence. The intimidation had been calibrated to exploit natural concerns about family safety and financial security, while avoiding the kind of explicit criminal behavior that would prompt immediate police response or community mobilization. The telephone harassment that Mrs. Patterson described followed patterns that suggested professional knowledge of psychological intimidation techniques, with calls timed to maximize disruption while avoiding easy identification or prosecution. The anonymous callers demonstrated detailed knowledge of resident schedules, family relationships, and personal concerns that could only have been obtained through extensive surveillance and investigation, and Mrs. Patterson had documented the telephone harassment in a notebook that she shared with Kim, recording dates, times, and descriptions of calls that had been received by herself and neighbors who had confided their experiences to her. The documentation revealed systematic patterns that indicated coordination and planning rather than random harassment by individual actors, patterns that suggested the involvement of organizations with substantial resources and sophisticated operational capabilities. The surveillance activities that Mrs. Patterson had observed included vehicles with out-of-state license plates that appeared regularly in the neighborhood, despite having no apparent legitimate purpose, vehicles that were occupied by individuals who appeared to be conducting systematic observation of resident activities and movement patterns. The surveillance had been conducted with sufficient skill to avoid easy identification while maintaining sufficient visibility to ensure that residents would notice and understand that they were being watched. Kim's interview with Mrs. Patterson revealed that the harassment had been particularly intense for residents who had expressed support for Dr. Thornfield's environmental research or who had attended public meetings where environmental concerns had been discussed. The targeting had created a chilling effect that had discouraged public participation in environmental advocacy while also undermining broader community organizing and social cohesion. The second interview on Kim's schedule was with Marcus Rodriguez, a local plumber who had lived in the Riverside neighborhood for 15 years and who had noticed unusual activities at several residential and commercial properties that might be connected to the unauthorized industrial operations that had been discovered at the abandoned complex. Rodriguez had contacted the police department after reading newspaper coverage of the investigation, offering information about suspicious installation and maintenance work that he had observed during his service calls throughout the area. Kim met Rodriguez at his workshop, a converted garage where he stored tools and equipment, while also serving as an informal meeting place for tradespeople who worked throughout the neighborhood. The workshop's atmosphere of practical competence and community connection provided a comfortable setting for discussing observations that Rodriguez had been reluctant to report through official channels because of concerns about potential retaliation against his business and family. Rodriguez's information concerned installation work that he had observed at several properties where environmental advocates lived, installation work that had been conducted by individuals who claimed to represent utility companies, but who had been performing tasks that were not consistent with normal utility maintenance or improvement projects. The suspicious installations had included equipment that appeared to be designed for surveillance or communication monitoring rather than for providing utility services. The installation activities that Rodriguez described had been conducted with sufficient apparent legitimacy to avoid immediate suspicion while incorporating technical elements that suggested purposes beyond normal utility maintenance. The workers had possessed proper uniforms and vehicles, but their equipment and procedures had included specialized components that Rodriguez had recognized as inconsistent with standard utility company practices. Rodriguez had also observed unusual Maintenance activities at commercial properties throughout the Riverside neighborhood. Maintenance activities that appeared to be designed for installing or concealing equipment, rather than for performing routine building maintenance or repair. Work. The commercial installations had been conducted during evening and weekend, hours when normal business activities would not provide cover for the work, suggesting efforts to avoid observation by property owners or tenants. The maintenance work that Rodriguez had documented included electrical installations that were more sophisticated than would be required for normal commercial purposes. Installations that suggested the buildings were being equipped for specialized communication or monitoring activities. The electrical work had been performed by individuals with apparent technical expertise, but the installations had been concealed in ways that suggested they were not authorized by property owners or tenants. Kim's third interview was with Dr. Maria Santos, a family physician who had maintained a medical practice in the Riverside neighborhood for over 20 years and who had observed health patterns that might be related to environmental contamination from the unauthorized industrial activities. Dr. Santos had contacted the police department after learning about the environmental aspects of the investigation, offering to share medical information that might support efforts to understand the scope and impact of environmental crimes. Dr. Santos met Kim at her medical office, where she had access to patient records and health statistics that documented patterns of illness and environmental health problems among neighborhood residents. Her medical practice had provided her with unique insights into community health trends and environmental impacts that might not be apparent to residents or investigators who lacked access to comprehensive health information. The health patterns that Dr. Santos described included elevated rates of respiratory diseases, neurological symptoms, and certain types of cancer among long-term residents of the Riverside neighborhood. Patterns that were consistent with exposure to the industrial chemicals that had been identified through environmental testing at the abandoned complex and in neighborhood soil samples. The health impacts appeared to be concentrated among residents who lived near former industrial sites or current areas of unauthorized industrial activity. Dr. Santos had also observed unusual patterns of anxiety and stress-related health problems among neighborhood residents, patterns that had intensified during the period when the harassment campaign against environmental advocates had been most active. The psychological health impacts reflected the community-wide effects of intimidation and surveillance that had created chronic stress and fear among residents who felt threatened but unable to protect themselves through normal legal or social channels. The medical evidence that Dr. Santos provided included documentation of health impacts that supported Dr. Thornfield's environmental research, while also demonstrating the human cost of environmental crimes that extended beyond immediate victims to affect entire communities. The health data provided scientific support for arguments that environmental protection was essential for community welfare and that environmental crimes pose significant risks to public health and safety. Dr. Santos had also received intimidating communications similar to those that had been delivered to other community leaders and environmental advocates. Communications that had escalated in intensity after she had begun documenting health patterns that might support environmental advocacy efforts. The harassment had included suggestions that her medical practice might face regulatory scrutiny or professional licensing challenges if she continued to collect and share health information that supported environmental protection efforts. Kim's fourth interview was with Susan Martinez, the director of the Riverside Community Library, who had been working to rebuild the library's historical collection after the fire that had destroyed much of the documentation that Dr. Thornfield had been using for his environmental research. Martinez had been contacted by several community members who had offered to donate materials that might help replace the destroyed documents. Donations that had revealed the existence of private archives and family collections that contained information relevant to the environmental investigation. Martinez met Kim at the library, where she had been organizing donated materials and attempting to recreate the historical documentation that had been lost in the fire. The library's rebuilding efforts had revealed that many neighborhood families possessed documents, photographs, and personal records that provided information about industrial activities and environmental conditions that had not been preserved in official archives. The donated materials that Martinez had received included corporate documents from defunct industrial companies, environmental monitoring reports that had never been made public, and correspondence between residents and regulatory agencies that documented ongoing environmental concerns and official responses that had often been inadequate or dismissive. The private archives contained information that complemented and extended Dr. Thornfield's research while also providing evidence of systematic efforts to suppress environmental information and advocacy. Martinez had also discovered that the library fire had been preceded by several attempts to access the historical collection by individuals who had claimed to represent academic researchers but who had demonstrated unusual interest in specific documents related to industrial history and environmental contamination. The attempted access to historical materials suggested that the library fire might have been preceded by intelligence-gathering activities designed to identify and target specific documents for destruction. The library's role as a community meeting place had also made Martinez aware of changes in social dynamics and community participation that reflected the impact of the intimidation campaign on neighborhood life. Attendance at library programs and community meetings had declined significantly, and residents had become reluctant to engage in discussions of local issues or environmental concerns that had previously been topics of active community interest. Kim's fifth interview was with Benjamin Turner, a local contractor who had been approached by representatives of development companies who had attempted to recruit him for construction projects that would have required violation of environmental regulations and building codes. Turner had contacted the police department after learning about the investigation, offering information about attempted corruption of local businesses and contractors who might be needed to support unauthorized development activities. Turner met Kim at a construction site where he was supervising renovation work, providing a practical setting for discussing the economic pressures and corruption attempts that had been directed at local businesses. The construction industry's central role in development projects had made contractors and building trades workers particularly vulnerable to pressure and inducements from organizations that needed to circumvent environmental and safety regulations. The corruption attempts that Turner described had included offers of lucrative contracts in exchange for agreement to perform construction work without proper permits or environmental compliance. Work that would have supported development projects that could not be completed through legitimate regulatory processes. The offers had been accompanied by suggestions that contractors who refused to cooperate might find themselves excluded from future work opportunities or subjected to regulatory scrutiny that could threaten their business operations. Turner had also observed unusual construction activities at several sites throughout the neighborhood. Activities that appeared to be designed for concealing or destroying evidence of environmental contamination rather than for supporting legitimate development or construction projects. The work had included soil removal and replacement activities that appeared designed to eliminate evidence of contamination while avoiding the proper environmental assessment and cleanup procedures that would be required for legitimate remediation projects. The construction industry intelligence that Turner provided revealed systematic efforts to corrupt local businesses and circumvent environmental regulations through economic inducements and intimidation. The corruption attempts demonstrated the financial resources and organizational capabilities that supported the criminal enterprise, while also revealing potential vulnerabilities that law enforcement might exploit to disrupt criminal activities. Kim's sixth interview was with Patricia Morrison, a social worker who had been providing counseling and support services to neighborhood residents who had been affected by the harassment campaign and environmental health problems. Morrison had contacted the police department after recognizing patterns in her clients' experiences that suggested coordinated criminal activity rather than individual problems or coincidental difficulties. Morrison met Kim at the community health center where she maintained her practice, providing access to case records and client information that documented the psychological and social impacts of environmental crime and intimidation on individual families and the broader community. Her professional experience had provided her with insights into the human cost of criminal activities that extended beyond immediate victims to affect entire social networks and community relationships. The counseling cases that Morrison described revealed systematic psychological impacts that were consistent with organized intimidation campaigns designed to suppress community organizing and environmental advocacy. Her clients had experienced symptoms of anxiety, depression, and social isolation that reflected the effectiveness of harassment techniques that were designed to undermine individual confidence and community solidarity. Morrison had also observed that the psychological impacts of the intimidation campaign had been particularly severe for elderly residents and families with children, groups that were especially vulnerable to threats and surveillance, activities that created fears about personal safety and family security. The targeting of vulnerable populations demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of community dynamics that had guided the criminal activities. The social work perspective that Morrison provided revealed the broader community impacts of environmental crime and corruption that extended far beyond immediate environmental damage to encompass systematic destruction of social cohesion and community resilience. The criminal activities had been designed not just to prevent environmental advocacy, but to undermine the social foundations that supported community organizing and collective action. As Kim completed his interviews and prepared his comprehensive report on the community impacts of the criminal activities, he reflected on the way that environmental crime operated through the systematic destruction of social trust and community solidarity. The harassment campaign had been designed to isolate individuals while undermining collective capacity for resistance and advocacy. The human stories that Kim had documented revealed the true cost of environmental crime, costs that were measured not just in environmental damage and health impacts, but in the destruction of community relationships and social institutions that provided the foundation for democratic participation and collective problem solving. The criminal enterprise had understood that environmental protection depended on community organizing and had therefore targeted the social infrastructure that made such organizing possible. The evening light filtered through the windows of Mrs. Patterson's living room as Kim concluded his final interview and prepared to return to the police station to complete his report. The community members he had interviewed had demonstrated remarkable courage in sharing their experiences despite ongoing fears about retaliation and further harassment. Their willingness to speak with law enforcement represented a form of resistance to the intimidation campaign while also providing crucial evidence that would support prosecution efforts and community protection initiatives. The human dimension of the investigation had revealed that environmental crime was ultimately about the power to control communities and suppress democratic participation in decisions that affected public health and environmental quality. The stories of ordinary people who had refused to be silenced by intimidation and harassment provided hope that communities could resist sophisticated criminal enterprises through collective action and mutual support. even when official institutions failed to provide adequate protection and justice. Detective Sarah Chun had learned during her 6 years with the Westfield Police Department's cybercrime unit that modern criminal investigations increasingly depended on the patient analysis of digital evidence that existed in forms invisible to casual observation, but that preserved detailed records of human activities across time and geographic boundaries. On this March evening, Chun sat in the department's digital forensics laboratory, surrounded by computer servers and monitoring equipment that had been processing data for weeks in support of the investigation into Dr. Thornfield's disappearance and the criminal enterprise that had apparently targeted him. The digital investigation had begun with analysis of Dr. Thornfield's personal computers and electronic devices, but it had quickly expanded to encompass examination of network traffic, surveillance footage, and communication records that revealed the scope and sophistication of the criminal activities that had operated throughout the Riverside neighborhood and beyond. Chun's work required specialized technical skills and infinite patience as she traced digital footprints through networks and databases that spanned multiple jurisdictions and technological platforms. The computer forensics analysis of Dr. Thornfield's equipment had revealed systematic intrusions into his research files and communication systems. Intrusions that had been conducted using sophisticated techniques that were typically associated with governmental or military cyber operations rather than conventional criminal activities. The digital intrusions had been designed to access and copy Dr. Thornfield's environmental research while also monitoring his communications with other advocates and legal advisors. Chun's examination of the intrusion techniques had revealed the use of advanced persistent threat methodologies that were characteristic of nation-state cyber operations, methodologies that required substantial technical resources and specialized expertise that were not commonly available to private criminal organizations. The sophistication of the cyber attack suggested that Dr. Thornfield's environmental research had attracted attention from organizations with capabilities that extended far beyond typical corporate or criminal interests. The network traffic analysis had revealed patterns of data exfiltration that indicated Dr. Thornfield's research files had been systematically copied and transmitted to servers located in multiple countries, servers that were registered to shell companies and organizations that appeared to exist primarily for the purpose of concealing the true recipients of the stolen data. The international scope of the data theft suggested coordination between multiple organizations and possible involvement of foreign intelligence services. Chun's analysis of Dr. Thornfield's email communications had revealed attempts to intercept and monitor his correspondence with environmental lawyers, scientists, and regulatory officials. Attempts that had been partially successful in accessing communications that contained sensitive information about legal strategies and regulatory enforcement activities. The email interception had provided the criminal organizations with advance knowledge of enforcement actions and legal challenges that might have threatened their unauthorized industrial operations. The surveillance camera footage that Chun had been analyzing came from multiple sources throughout the Riverside neighborhood, including public safety cameras, traffic monitoring systems, and private security installations that had captured images of individuals and vehicles involved in the harassment campaign and unauthorized industrial activities. The video analysis required sophisticated software and careful cross-referencing to identify patterns and connections that might not be apparent from individual footage segments. The video evidence had revealed systematic surveillance activities conducted by individuals using vehicles and equipment that suggested professional training and substantial financial resources. The surveillance teams had operated in coordinated fashion across multiple locations, using communication systems and operational procedures that indicated military or intelligence background rather than typical private investigation or corporate security experience. Chun's analysis of cell phone and communication records had revealed networks of encrypted communications that connected individuals throughout the region who had been involved in various aspects of the criminal enterprise. The communication analysis had required cooperation with federal agencies that possessed the technical capabilities and legal authorities necessary to access encrypted communication systems and trace communications across international boundaries. The cell phone data had revealed movement patterns and coordination activities that supported theories about the scope and organization of the criminal enterprise, while also providing evidence of planning and coordination for specific criminal activities, including harassment, intimidation, and potentially violence. The communication records had captured conversations and text messages that provided direct evidence of criminal intent and conspiracy. The financial forensics analysis that Chun had been conducting had revealed complex networks of money transfers and business relationships that connected the unauthorized industrial operations to legitimate businesses, governmental contracts, and international financial institutions. The financial investigation had required collaboration with banking regulators and international law enforcement agencies that possessed expertise in tracking sophisticated money laundering and corporate fraud schemes. The financial evidence had revealed that the unauthorized industrial operations were generating substantial profits through the production and sale of specialized materials and chemicals that were being distributed through legitimate commercial channels without proper environmental compliance or safety testing. The financial scale of the operations indicated that environmental crimes were being committed for profit motives that involved hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. Chun's investigation of social media and online communications had revealed systematic disinformation campaigns that were designed to discredit environmental advocates and promote public acceptance of development projects that would benefit the criminal enterprise. The disinformation campaigns had used sophisticated techniques for creating false grassroots support while suppressing legitimate environmental concerns through coordinated online harassment and content manipulation. The social media analysis had revealed the use of automated systems and artificial intelligence technologies to generate fake social media accounts and coordinate messaging campaigns that appeared to represent authentic community opinion, but that were actually controlled by the criminal organizations. The technological sophistication of the disinformation operations suggested access to advanced cyber capabilities that were typically associated with governmental or military information warfare activities. The database analysis that Chun had been conducting had revealed connections between the Westfield criminal activities and similar operations in multiple states and countries. Connections that suggested the existence of an international network of environmental crimes that operated through coordinated attacks on environmental advocates and regulatory systems. The international scope of the criminal enterprise had required coordination with federal and international law enforcement agencies. The database evidence had revealed that Dr. Thornfield's environmental research had identified patterns of contamination and illegal industrial activity that extended far beyond the Riverside neighborhood to encompass a regional network of unauthorized operations that were causing significant environmental damage and public health risks. The scope of the environmental crimes had provided motives for criminal activities that might include murder and other forms of violence to protect commercial interests worth billions of dollars. Chun's analysis of GPS tracking data had revealed movement patterns of vehicles and individuals that connected the harassment activities in Westfield to similar operations in neighboring communities, operations that had targeted environmental advocates and regulatory officials throughout the region. The GPS data had provided evidence of coordination and planning that supported theories about organized criminal enterprise rather than isolated local criminal activity. The tracking data had also revealed that some of the vehicles involved in the harassment activities were registered to governmental agencies and private contractors that worked for military and intelligence organizations, registrations that raised questions about whether the environmental crimes were being committed with the knowledge or support of governmental officials who had interests in suppressing environmental advocacy and regulatory enforcement. The computer network analysis that Chun had been conducting had revealed that the unauthorized industrial operations were using sophisticated computer systems for process control, environmental monitoring, and communication that were integrated with legitimate industrial and governmental networks. The network integration had provided the criminal organizations with access to information and capabilities that would not normally be available to private criminal enterprises. The network evidence had revealed that the criminal organizations possessed detailed knowledge of regulatory procedures, enforcement activities, and environmental monitoring that suggested access to insider information from governmental agencies and regulatory organizations. The insider access had provided the criminal enterprise with advance warning of enforcement actions while also enabling them to manipulate regulatory processes to avoid detection and prosecution. Chun's investigation of electronic payment systems had revealed that the criminal organizations were using cryptocurrency and other digital payment technologies to conduct financial transactions that were designed to avoid detection by traditional banking and financial monitoring systems. The digital payment analysis had required specialized expertise and coordination with financial intelligence units that possessed capabilities for tracking digital currency transactions. The digital payment evidence had revealed financial connections between the environmental crimes and other criminal activities, including money laundering, drug trafficking, and arms smuggling that suggested the environmental crimes were being conducted by organizations that were involved in multiple forms of serious criminal activity. The connections to other criminal enterprises had provided additional motives and resources for violence and intimidation directed against environmental advocates. The industrial control systems analysis that Chun had been conducting had revealed that the unauthorized industrial operations were using computer systems for process monitoring and environmental control that were capable of manipulating environmental monitoring data and concealing contamination from regulatory oversight. The industrial systems had been designed to operate without external monitoring while providing false information to regulatory agencies. The control systems evidence had revealed sophisticated engineering and technical capabilities that suggested the involvement of individuals with advanced technical training and access to specialized equipment that was typically available only to governmental or military organizations. The technical sophistication of the unauthorized operations had required substantial investment and expertise that extended far beyond typical criminal capabilities. Chun's analysis of satellite imagery and remote sensing data had revealed the scope and scale of the unauthorized industrial activities while also providing evidence of systematic efforts to conceal operations from aerial surveillance and satellite monitoring. The remote sensing analysis had required coordination with federal agencies that possessed access to classified surveillance capabilities and intelligence resources. The satellite evidence had revealed that the unauthorized industrial operations were much larger in scope than had been apparent from ground-based investigation, with activities extending across multiple states and involving substantial infrastructure investments that indicated long-term planning and substantial financial resources. The scale of the operations had provided additional context for understanding the motives and capabilities of the criminal enterprise. The voice recognition and audio analysis that Chun had been conducting had revealed patterns in the anonymous telephone calls and threatening communications that had been used to intimidate environmental advocates. The audio analysis had identified vocal characteristics and background sounds that could be used to identify the sources of threatening communications, while also providing evidence of coordination between different harassment activities. The audio evidence had revealed that some of the threatening communications had been made using voice modification technology and calling systems that were typically available only to governmental and military organizations. Technology that suggested access to advanced communication capabilities that extended beyond typical criminal resources. The technical sophistication of the harassment communications had provided additional evidence of governmental or military involvement in the criminal enterprise. As Chun completed her analysis of the digital evidence and prepared her comprehensive report for Detective Captain Foster, she reflected on the way that modern criminal investigations required technical expertise and resources that extended far beyond traditional law enforcement capabilities. The digital investigation had revealed criminal activities that operated across multiple jurisdictions and technological platforms, activities that required international cooperation and federal resources to investigate effectively. The digital evidence had revealed the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise that had targeted Dr. Thornfield and other environmental advocates, evidence that supported theories about organized criminal activity that extended far beyond local environmental crimes to encompass international networks of corruption and violence. The technical capabilities that the criminal organizations had demonstrated suggested access to governmental and military resources that raised questions about official complicity in environmental crimes. The digital forensics investigation had provided crucial evidence for understanding both Dr. Thornfield's disappearance and the broader criminal enterprise that had apparently motivated his targeting. Evidence that would support prosecution efforts, while also revealing the need for enhanced environmental protection and regulatory enforcement. The patient analysis of digital evidence had preserved information that could not be destroyed through intimidation or violence, information that would speak for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The late evening light filtered through the laboratory windows as Chen secured her equipment and prepared to brief the investigation team about her findings. The digital investigation had required months of patient analysis and international cooperation, but it had provided essential evidence that revealed the true scope and significance of environmental crimes that had threatened not just individual advocates but entire communities and regulatory systems. The digital evidence would serve as the foundation for prosecution efforts that could hold accountable the organizations and individuals responsible for environmental crimes and corruption, while also providing the scientific and technical information necessary to protect communities from ongoing environmental threats. The cybercrime investigation had transformed invisible digital activities into concrete evidence that could not be suppressed through traditional methods of intimidation and corruption. Asterisk. Lieutenant David Park had learned during his 14 years with the Westfield Police Department's Search and Rescue Division that missing persons investigations required a unique combination of scientific methodology and intuitive understanding of human behavior, a balance between systematic coverage of geographic areas and psychological insight into the decisions that people made when they found themselves in desperate circumstances. On this April morning, Park stood at the command post that had been established in the parking lot of the Riverside Community Center, coordinating search activities that had been ongoing for nearly 6 months since Dr. Thornfield's disappearance. The search operation had evolved significantly since its initial phase, when efforts had focused on areas near Dr. Thornfield's home and the locations where he'd been known to conduct his environmental research. As the investigation had revealed, the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise that had apparently targeted him, the search parameters had expanded to include locations throughout the region where victims might be held or where evidence might be concealed by organizations with substantial resources and operational capabilities. Park's coordination responsibilities included managing teams of professional searchers, volunteer civilians, and specialized personnel who brought different skills and equipment to the comprehensive effort to locate Dr. Thornfield or determine his fate. The search operation required careful logistics and communication to ensure that all potential locations were examined systematically while avoiding duplication of effort and maintaining the safety of search personnel who might encounter dangerous conditions or hostile activities. The ground search teams that Park supervised had been examining areas throughout the Westfield region using techniques that ranged from traditional visual searches to sophisticated technological approaches that could detect human presence or disturbance in challenging terrain. The search activities required adaptation to different environments and conditions while maintaining consistent standards for thoroughness and evidence preservation. The first major search area had been the Riverside Creek watershed, where environmental contamination from the unauthorized industrial operations had created a complex landscape of polluted waterways, abandoned facilities, and restricted access areas that provided numerous opportunities for concealment. The watershed search had required coordination with environmental specialists who could ensure searchers' safety while also identifying locations where criminal activities might have occurred. Park had organized the watershed search using systematic grid patterns that ensured complete coverage while allowing for detailed examination of areas where environmental conditions or human activities had created potential hiding places. The search teams had used both visual inspection and technological detection methods to examine areas that might contain human remains or evidence of criminal activities. The watershed search had revealed several locations where soil disturbance and environmental conditions suggested recent human activity that was not consistent with legitimate environmental monitoring or recreational use. The disturbed areas had been documented and examined by forensic specialists who could determine whether the disturbances were related to criminal activities or to natural environmental processes. The abandoned industrial facilities throughout the region had provided another major focus for search activities, as these locations offered the infrastructure and isolation that would be necessary for holding captives or conducting unauthorized activities that required concealment from official oversight. Park had coordinated searches of dozens of abandoned buildings and industrial sites, using teams that included both search specialists and tactical personnel who could safely examine potentially dangerous locations. The industrial facility searches had required specialized equipment and procedures to address safety hazards including structural instability, environmental contamination, and potential booby traps or security systems that might have been installed to protect unauthorized activities. The search teams had used remote sensing equipment and robotic systems to examine areas that were too dangerous for direct human inspection. The searches of abandoned Facilities had revealed evidence of recent occupancy and activity at several locations that had been officially vacant for years. Evidence that included temporary living accommodations, communication equipment, and industrial materials that suggested ongoing operations that were being concealed from regulatory oversight. The evidence had supported theories about the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise, while also providing potential leads for locating. Dr. Thornfield, Park's coordination of underwater search activities had focused on areas of the Westfield River and coastal waters where evidence or victims might have been disposed of by criminal organizations, seeking to eliminate traces of their activities. The underwater searches had required specialized diving teams and remote sensing equipment that could detect objects and disturbances in challenging aquatic environments. The underwater search operations had revealed several areas where the river bottom had been disturbed and where objects had been deposited that were not consistent with natural debris or legitimate commercial activities. The underwater discoveries had included containers and equipment that appeared to be related to unauthorized industrial operations, equipment that had been disposed of in apparent efforts to eliminate evidence of criminal activities. The underwater evidence recovery had required careful coordination with environmental specialists and forensic experts who could safely examine potentially hazardous materials while preserving evidence that might be crucial for prosecution efforts. The underwater searches had provided important evidence while also revealing the extent to which the criminal organizations had used aquatic disposal methods to conceal their activities. The aerial search operations that Park had coordinated had used both manned aircraft and unmanned drone systems to examine large geographic areas and identify locations that warranted more detailed ground-based investigation. The aerial searches had been particularly valuable for identifying areas that were difficult to access through conventional means and for detecting patterns of activity that might not be apparent from ground-level observation. The aerial search activities had revealed vehicle tracks and infrastructure modifications at remote locations throughout the region, modifications that suggested ongoing industrial activities that were being conducted without proper permits or environmental oversight. The aerial evidence had provided broader geographic context for understanding the scope of the criminal enterprise, while also identifying specific locations that required detailed investigation. The aerial searches had also been used to monitor areas where criminal activities might be ongoing, monitoring that had revealed patterns of vehicle movement and personnel activity that suggested continued operations despite law enforcement investigation. The aerial surveillance had provided real-time intelligence that had supported tactical operations and evidence collection activities. Park's coordination of search activities had required close cooperation with multiple law enforcement agencies and specialized units that possess different capabilities and jurisdictional authorities. The multi-agency coordination had been essential for addressing the interstate and international scope of the criminal activities, while also ensuring that search operations complied with legal requirements and jurisdictional limitations. The federal law enforcement agencies that had joined the search operation had provided specialized capabilities including advanced surveillance technology, international intelligence resources, and tactical units that could safely examine locations where armed resistance might be encountered. The federal involvement had also provided access to classified information and resources that had enhanced the effectiveness of search activities. The international cooperation that Park had facilitated had included coordination with law enforcement agencies in countries where the criminal organizations appeared to have operations or where evidence suggested that victims might have been transported. The international cooperation had required diplomatic coordination and careful attention to legal procedures that governed cross-border law enforcement activities. The volunteer search efforts that Park had organized had involved hundreds of community members who had provided additional personnel and local knowledge that enhanced the effectiveness of professional search operations. The volunteer searchers had included environmental advocates, outdoor recreation enthusiasts, and community members who possessed detailed knowledge of local geography and conditions. The volunteer coordination had required careful training and supervision to ensure searcher safety, while also maintaining the integrity of evidence collection and documentation procedures. The volunteers had provided valuable assistance while also demonstrating community commitment to finding Dr. Thornfield and holding accountable those responsible for his disappearance. The specialized search techniques that Park had employed had included ground-penetrating radar for detecting buried objects or remains, thermal imaging for detecting human presence in concealed locations, and chemical detection systems for identifying human decomposition or environmental contamination that might indicate criminal activities. The technological approaches had supplemented traditional search methods while providing capabilities for examining areas that would be difficult to search through conventional means. The ground-penetrating radar surveys had revealed several areas where subsurface anomalies suggested the presence of buried objects or structural modifications that were not apparent from surface observation. The radar evidence had guided more detailed excavation and investigation activities that had revealed additional evidence of criminal activities while also eliminating potential locations for human remains. The thermal imaging surveys had been particularly valuable for examining large buildings and underground facilities where victims might be held or where criminal activities might be ongoing. The thermal detection had revealed heat signatures and activity patterns that had provided tactical intelligence while also identifying areas that warranted detailed investigation. The chemical detection activities had used sophisticated sensors and laboratory analysis to identify trace evidence of human presence or industrial activities that might be connected to the criminal enterprise. The chemical evidence had provided scientific support for search activities while also documenting environmental contamination that supported prosecution efforts. Park's documentation of search activities had created comprehensive records of all areas examined and all evidence collected, records that would support both ongoing investigation activities and potential prosecution efforts. The search documentation had required careful attention to legal procedures and evidence handling requirements while also creating historical records that could inform future search operations. The search records had revealed patterns of criminal activity and evidence concealment that provided insights into the operational methods and capabilities of the criminal organizations. The documentation had also revealed the geographic scope and environmental impact of criminal activities that extended far beyond initial estimates based on local investigation. The psychological aspects of the search operation had required Park to balance the emotional needs of family members and community supporters with the practical requirements of systematic investigation and evidence collection. The search activities had provided hope and community engagement while also revealing difficult truths about the scope and severity of the criminal activities that had targeted Dr. Thornfield, the family liaison. Activities that Park had coordinated had involved regular communication with Dr. Thornfield's relatives and close associates, communication that had provided emotional support while also gathering information that might assist search efforts. The family involvement had required careful balance between transparency and operational security, as information about search activities might be valuable to criminal organizations seeking to avoid detection. The community engagement activities had included public information campaigns and volunteer coordination that had maintained community awareness and support for search efforts, while also gathering intelligence from residents who might have observed relevant activities. The community involvement had demonstrated public commitment to environmental protection and justice while also providing practical assistance for search operations. As Park reviewed the comprehensive search efforts that had been conducted over the past 6 months, he reflected on the way that missing persons investigations revealed both the dedication of law enforcement and community members and the challenges of investigating sophisticated criminal enterprises that possessed substantial resources and operational capabilities. The search operation had revealed the scope and impact of environmental crimes that extended far beyond Dr. Thornfield's individual case to encompass regional networks of illegal activities that threatened community health and environmental protection. The systematic search efforts had provided crucial evidence while also demonstrating the persistence and dedication required to investigate complex criminal enterprises. The ongoing search activities would continue until Dr. Thornfield was found or until all reasonable possibilities had been exhausted. Activities that represented both professional responsibility and community commitment to justice and truth. The search operation had become a symbol of resistance to criminal enterprises that sought to suppress environmental advocacy through violence and intimidation. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows of the command post as Park prepared his daily briefing for Detective Captain Foster and the multi-agency investigation team. The search operation had consumed substantial resources and required ongoing coordination with multiple agencies and organizations, but it had provided essential evidence and demonstrated community commitment to environmental protection and justice. The methodical exploration of every possible location where Dr. Thornfield might be found had revealed the true scope of the criminal enterprise while also providing hope that truth and justice could prevail despite the efforts of powerful organizations to suppress environmental advocacy and regulatory enforcement. The search would continue as long as there remained any possibility that Dr. Thornfield could be found alive or that additional evidence could be recovered to support prosecution efforts. The evening stretched ahead with the promise of continued search activities that would explore new areas and employ new technologies in the ongoing effort to find Dr. Thornfield and hold accountable those responsible for environmental crimes that had threatened both individual advocates and entire communities. The patient, systematic search represented the best of law, enforcement dedication, and community solidarity in the face of sophisticated criminal enterprises that sought to profit from environmental destruction and the suppression of democratic participation in environmental protection. Detective Captain Amanda Foster sat in the conference room of the Westfield Police Department as the May evening light faded beyond the tall windows. Surrounded by case files, evidence charts, and investigative reports that represented 7 months of intensive work by dozens of law enforcement professionals, forensic specialists, and federal agents. The investigation into Dr. Edward Thornfield's disappearance had evolved into something far larger than a missing person case, revealing a criminal enterprise that stretched across state and national boundaries and that had implications for environmental protection, governmental corruption, and international organized crime. Evidence synthesis that Foster had been conducting for the past 2 weeks had revealed patterns and connections that transformed individual pieces of information into a comprehensive understanding of how environmental advocacy had been systematically suppressed through intimidation, surveillance, and violence orchestrated by organizations that possessed capabilities typically associated with governmental and military operations. The forensic evidence that Dr. Rachel Morrison had painstakingly analyzed had provided the scientific foundation for understanding both the environmental crimes that had motivated Dr. Thornfield's research and the sophisticated methods that had been used to eliminate him as a threat to powerful commercial and political interests. The soil samples, fiber evidence, DNA analysis, and chemical signatures had created an unshakable record of criminal activities that could not be disputed or suppressed through legal technicalities. The digital investigation conducted by Detective Sarah Chun had revealed the technological sophistication and international scope of the criminal enterprise, demonstrating how cyber capabilities, electronic surveillance, and financial networks had been coordinated to support environmental crimes while simultaneously suppressing advocacy and regulatory enforcement. The digital evidence had shown connections to governmental and military organizations that raised questions about official complicity in environmental corruption. The witness interviews conducted by Detective Michael Torres had documented the human impact of the criminal activities, while also revealing the community-wide effects of systematic intimidation designed to suppress environmental advocacy and democratic participation in environmental protection decisions. The testimony had demonstrated how environmental crimes operated through the destruction of social trust and community solidarity. The building investigations, led by Detective Jennifer Walsh, had revealed the physical infrastructure that supported unauthorized industrial operations, infrastructure that had been concealed in abandoned facilities while being protected by sophisticated security and communication systems. The investigation of empty warehouses and manufacturing buildings had provided evidence of the scale and complexity of illegal operations that had generated substantial profits through environmental destruction. The community impact assessment conducted by Detective Robert Kim had documented how environmental crimes affected entire neighborhoods and social networks, revealing the systematic targeting of vulnerable populations and community leaders who might organize resistance to environmental destruction. The community investigation had shown how environmental crime operated as a form of domestic terrorism designed to suppress democratic participation. The search operations coordinated by Lieutenant David Park had revealed the geographic scope of criminal activities while also demonstrating the dedication and persistence required to investigate sophisticated criminal enterprises that possess substantial resources for concealing evidence and eliminating threats. The search efforts had provided crucial evidence while also maintaining hope that justice could prevail despite powerful opposition. Foster's synthesis of the accumulated evidence had revealed that Dr. Thornfield's environmental research had identified not just local contamination problems but a regional network of unauthorized industrial operations that were generating billions of dollars in profits through the production and sale of specialized materials without proper environmental compliance or safety oversight. The financial scale of the operations had provided motives for violence and corruption that could justify extreme measures to protect commercial interests. The investigation had revealed that the criminal enterprise operated through a network of shell companies, governmental contractors, and legitimate businesses that provided cover for illegal activities while also facilitating the corruption of regulatory processes and law enforcement agencies. The organizational structure had been designed to insulate senior leadership from criminal liability while providing operational capabilities that exceeded those available to conventional criminal organizations. Evidence had shown that Dr. Thornfield's disappearance was part of a broader campaign against environmental advocates throughout the region, a campaign that had included surveillance, harassment, violence, and potentially multiple murders designed to suppress environmental research and advocacy that threatened the criminal enterprise. The systematic nature of the attacks on environmental advocates had demonstrated the existence of organized criminal activities that constituted domestic terrorism. Foster's analysis had revealed connections between the environmental crimes and other illegal activities, including drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and money laundering that suggested the environmental operations were being conducted by organizations that were involved in multiple forms of serious criminal activity. The connections to other criminal enterprises had provided additional resources and capabilities for violence and corruption, while also creating additional motives for suppressing law enforcement investigation. International aspects of the criminal enterprise had required coordination with federal agencies and foreign law enforcement organizations that possessed jurisdiction and capabilities for COFO, investigating crimes that crossed national boundaries. The international investigation had revealed connections to foreign corporations and governmental organizations that had interests in suppressing environmental regulation and advocacy. In the United States, the governmental corruption aspects of the case had required careful coordination with federal investigators and prosecutors who possessed the authority and resources necessary to investigate corruption of federal agencies and officials. The corruption investigation had revealed systematic efforts to influence environmental policy and regulatory enforcement through campaign contributions, lobbying activities, and direct bribery of governmental officials. Foster's preparation for the arrest operations had required coordination with multiple law enforcement agencies and tactical units that could safely apprehend suspects who possess substantial resources and who might attempt to resist arrest through violence or flight to foreign countries. The arrest planning had included coordination with international law enforcement agencies that could prevent suspects from escaping prosecution through relocation to countries without extradition agreements. The prosecution preparation had required coordination with federal prosecutors who possessed the expertise and resources necessary to prosecute complex environmental crimes, corruption, and organized criminal enterprises. The prosecution planning had included development of evidence presentation strategies that could effectively communicate the scope and significance of the criminal activities to judges and juries who might not have specialized knowledge of environmental law or organized crime. The evidence preservation activities had required implementation of sophisticated security measures to protect evidence and witnesses from tampering or intimidation by criminal organizations that had demonstrated willingness to use violence to suppress investigation and prosecution. The security measures had included witness protection programs and evidence storage procedures that could prevent destruction or corruption of crucial information. The community protection activities had required coordination with local law enforcement agencies and community organizations to implement security measures that could protect residents from retaliation while also maintaining community engagement in environmental protection efforts. The community protection had included public education activities and support services for residents who had been affected by intimidation and harassment. Foster's coordination with federal agencies had revealed that the environmental crimes in Westfield were connected to similar operations throughout the country, operations that had created a national network of environmental destruction and advocacy suppression that posed significant threats to environmental protection and democratic participation. The national scope of the criminal activities had required federal coordination and resources that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities. The federal investigation had revealed connections between the environmental crimes and national security concerns that related to the production and distribution of materials that could be used for military or terrorist purposes. The national security implications had required coordination with intelligence agencies and military organizations that possessed specialized knowledge and capabilities for addressing threats that involved both criminal activity and potential terrorism. The international cooperation that had been developed during the investigation had created opportunities for addressing environmental crimes that operated across national boundaries, while also developing capabilities for investigating organized criminal enterprises that used international operations to avoid prosecution. The international cooperation had demonstrated the importance of multilateral approaches to addressing environmental crime and corruption. The media coordination that Foster had managed throughout the investigation had required careful balance between public transparency and operational security, ensuring that community members remained informed about investigation progress while protecting ongoing operations from interference by criminal organizations. The media strategy had also included efforts to counter disinformation campaigns that had been organized by the criminal enterprise to discredit environmental advocacy and law enforcement investigation. The policy implications of the investigation had required coordination with legislative and regulatory officials who possessed the authority to implement systematic reforms that could prevent similar criminal activities in the future. The policy recommendations had included enhanced environmental monitoring, strengthened regulatory enforcement, and improved protection for environmental advocates who face threats and intimidation. As Foster prepared for the final briefing that would precede the arrest operations, she reflected on the way that the investigation had revealed both the vulnerability of environmental protection systems and the dedication of law enforcement professionals and community members who were committed to environmental justice and democratic participation. The investigation had demonstrated that environmental crimes posed threats that extended far beyond immediate environmental damage to encompass systematic attacks on democratic institutions and community welfare. Arrest operations that would begin the following morning would represent the culmination of months of investigation, while also marking the beginning of prosecution efforts that could hold accountable those responsible for environmental crimes and corruption. The arrests would send a message that environmental crimes would not be tolerated, and that law enforcement possessed the capabilities and dedication necessary to investigate sophisticated criminal enterprises regardless of their resources and political connections. Asterisk. The prosecution phase of the case would require continued coordination and dedication from law enforcement professionals, prosecutors, and community members who were committed to environmental protection and justice. The prosecution would provide opportunities to demonstrate that environmental crimes could be successfully investigated and prosecuted despite the challenges posed by sophisticated criminal organizations and corrupt governmental officials. The long-term impact of the POV investigation would depend on the implementation of systematic reforms that could prevent similar criminal activities while also strengthening environmental protection and community resilience. The investigation had revealed the importance of community engagement and environmental advocacy for maintaining democratic oversight of environmental protection while also demonstrating the dedication required to resist criminal enterprises that sought to profit from environmental destruction. The evening light had faded completely as Foster completed her final preparations for the arrest operations that would attempt to bring justice for Dr. Thornfield and the other victims of environmental crime while also protecting communities from ongoing threats. The investigation had required extraordinary dedication and coordination, but it had demonstrated that environmental crimes could be successfully investigated and prosecuted when law enforcement agencies possessed the resources and commitment necessary to address sophisticated criminal enterprises. The case would continue through prosecution and potential appeals. But the investigation had already achieved significant success in documenting environmental crimes and corruption, while also developing capabilities for addressing similar criminal activities in the future. The dedication of law enforcement professionals and community members had demonstrated that environmental protection and democratic participation could be maintained despite threats from powerful criminal organizations. The quiet confidence that filled the conference room reflected the satisfaction of professional work completed thoroughly and carefully. Work that had revealed truth despite sophisticated efforts to conceal it, and that had demonstrated the power of patient investigation and community solidarity to achieve justice even when confronted by seemingly overwhelming criminal enterprises. The investigation had honored Dr. Thornfield's commitment to environmental protection, while also establishing foundations for continued environmental advocacy and community protection. The arrest operations began at dawn on a quiet Tuesday morning in late May, when coordinated teams of federal agents and local law enforcement officers moved simultaneously to execute warrants at 17 locations throughout the region, bringing to a close an investigation that had revealed one of the most sophisticated environmental crime networks ever documented in the United States. Detective Captain Amanda Foster watched from the command center as the PVN carefully planned operations unfolded with the precision that had characterized every aspect of the investigation that had consumed nearly 8 months of intensive work. The primary arrest location was the executive offices of Coastal Environmental Services, where Dr. Patricia Hoffman and 3 of her senior associates were taken into custody on charges that included conspiracy, environmental crimes, racketeering, and murder in connection with Dr. Edward Thornfield's death. The arrests had been conducted without incident, reflecting the thorough preparation and coordination that had ensured the safety of both law enforcement personnel and the suspects who were being apprehended. The search of Coastal Environmental Services had yielded additional evidence that confirmed the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprise, including financial records that documented the movement of hundreds of millions of dollars through shell companies and offshore accounts, communication records that revealed coordination with governmental officials and international criminal organizations, and technical documents that described unauthorized industrial operations that had been conducted throughout the region. The secondary arrest operations had targeted individuals at abandoned industrial facilities, private residences, and commercial locations where the investigation had revealed criminal activities, ranging from environmental contamination to witness intimidation. The coordinated arrests had been designed to prevent communication between suspects and to minimize opportunities for evidence destruction or flight to avoid prosecution. Most significant arrest had occurred at a private airfield 30 miles from Westfield, where federal agents had apprehended Robert Martinez, the former head of the regional EPA office, as he attempted to board a private aircraft bound for a country without extradition agreements with the United States. Martinez's arrest had been particularly significant because his position had provided the criminal enterprise with insider access to regulatory processes and enforcement activities. The discovery of Dr. Thornfield's location had come during the Viacom search of an abandoned warehouse facility that had been identified through the digital investigation and confirmed through ground-penetrating radar surveys. Dr. Thornfield had been found alive but in poor health, having been held captive for 8 months in a concealed underground facility that had been constructed specifically for long-term detention of individuals who posed threats to the criminal enterprise. Dr. Thornfield's rescue had been conducted by a specialized tactical team that had been trained for hostage recovery operations. A team that had been standing by throughout the arrest operations in case the investigation led to the discovery of captives or hostages. His medical condition had required immediate hospitalization, but preliminary examinations had indicated that he would recover fully from his ordeal and would be able to provide testimony that would support prosecution efforts. The medical treatment that Dr. Thornfield had received during his captivity had been designed to keep him alive and conscious while preventing him from escaping or communicating with potential rescuers. The medical evidence had provided additional charges against the criminal enterprise while also demonstrating the systematic planning and resources that had been devoted to suppressing environmental advocacy through kidnapping and torture. The reunion between Dr. Thornfield and his family members had been conducted at the regional medical center where he was receiving treatment. A reunion that had been carefully managed to protect his privacy, while also allowing law enforcement officials to begin the process of gathering information about his experiences during captivity. The family reunion had provided emotional closure while also marking the beginning of Dr. Thornfield's recovery and reintegration into community life. The evidence recovery operations that had accompanied the arrests had yielded massive quantities of documents, computer equipment, and physical evidence that would support prosecution efforts while also providing information about criminal activities that extended far beyond the immediate charges against individual defendants. The evidence processing would require months of additional work by forensic specialists and investigators who would prepare materials for use in complex trials. Asterisk. The environmental remediation activities that had begun immediately following the arrests had focused on stopping ongoing contamination and beginning the process of cleaning up environmental damage that had been caused by unauthorized industrial operations. The remediation work had required coordination between law enforcement agencies, environmental specialists, and public health officials who possessed the expertise necessary to address contamination safely and effectively. The community notification activities had included public meetings and media briefings that had informed residents about the investigation results while also providing information about environmental remediation and health monitoring that would be conducted to address contamination concerns. The community engagement had been designed to restore public confidence while also ensuring that residents had access to accurate information about environmental and health risks. The prosecution preparation had required coordination between federal and state prosecutors who would handle different aspects of the criminal charges. Coordination that had been necessary because the criminal enterprise had operated across multiple jurisdictions and had violated both federal and state laws. The prosecution strategy had been designed to ensure that all defendants would face appropriate charges while avoiding conflicts between different prosecutorial authorities. The federal charges had included violations of environmental laws, racketeering statutes, and conspiracy laws that carried potential sentences of decades in prison for senior members of the criminal enterprise. The federal prosecution had been assigned to a specialized environmental crimes unit that possessed the expertise and resources necessary to handle complex cases involving organized criminal enterprises and governmental corruption. The state charges had included murder, kidnapping, and environmental crimes that would be prosecuted under state jurisdiction. Charges that would ensure that defendants would face accountability even if federal prosecution efforts encountered legal or procedural obstacles. The state prosecution had been coordinated with federal efforts to ensure comprehensive accountability for all criminal activities. The asset forfeiture activities had begun immediately following the arrests, with federal agents seizing bank accounts, real estate, and business assets that had been acquired through criminal activities or that had been used to support environmental crimes. The asset forfeiture had been designed to recover funds that could be used for environmental remediation and victim compensation, while also preventing defendants from using criminal proceeds to fund their legal defense. The international cooperation that had been developed during the Fayong de Kyoto investigation had continued during the arrest and prosecution phase, with foreign law enforcement agencies providing assistance with evidence collection and preventing suspects from fleeing to other countries. The international cooperation had been essential for addressing criminal activities that had operated across national boundaries. The witness protection activities had included enhanced security for Dr. Thornfield and other witnesses who had provided crucial testimony, protection that had been necessary because of threats that had continued even after the arrests of primary suspects. The witness protection had required coordination between federal and local law enforcement agencies that could provide comprehensive security for individuals who remained at risk. The policy reform activities that had been initiated in response to the investigation had included enhanced environmental monitoring, strengthened regulatory enforcement, and improved protection for environmental advocates who faced threats and intimidation. The policy reforms had been designed to prevent similar criminal activities while also strengthening democratic participation in environmental protection decisions. The legislative response had included hearings and investigations by congressional committees that possessed oversight authority for environmental agencies and law enforcement organizations. The legislative activities had been designed to identify systematic failures that had allowed the criminal enterprise to operate, while also developing recommendations for preventing similar problems in the future. The academic and scientific response had included research and analysis by environmental scientists and policy experts who had examined the investigation results to identify lessons that could inform environmental protection efforts. The academic response had helped translate the investigation results into broader understanding of environmental crime and corruption that could benefit other communities and regions. The community healing activities had included counseling and support services for residents who had been affected by intimidation and harassment, services that had been designed to help individuals and families recover from trauma while also rebuilding community trust and solidarity. The healing activities had been supported by both governmental and nonprofit organizations that specialized in community recovery and resilience. The environmental justice activities had included efforts to ensure that environmental remediation and community protection were conducted in ways that addressed the disproportionate impacts that environmental crimes had had on vulnerable populations and communities of color. The environmental justice approach had been designed to ensure that recovery efforts strengthened rather than undermined community equity and empowerment. The memorial activities that had been organized to honor Dr. Thornfield's courage and dedication had included the establishment of an environmental research center that would continue his work while also providing resources for future environmental advocates and scientists. The memorial had been designed to ensure that his sacrifice would inspire continued efforts to protect environmental health and community welfare. As the immediate aftermath of the arrests settled into the longer-term processes of prosecution and community recovery, Detective Captain Foster reflected on the way that patient investigation and community solidarity had ultimately prevailed against sophisticated criminal enterprises that had possessed substantial resources and governmental connections. The investigation had demonstrated that environmental crimes could be successfully prosecuted when law enforcement agencies possessed the dedication and coordination necessary to address complex criminal activities. The case had revealed the importance of environmental advocacy, and community engagement for maintaining democratic oversight of environmental protection, while also demonstrating the threats that environmental advocates faced from criminal organizations that were willing to use violence and corruption to protect their profits. The investigation had validated Dr. Thornfield's research while also establishing protections for future environmental advocates. The long-term impact of the investigation would depend on continued vigilance and community engagement to ensure that environmental protection remained a priority and that criminal enterprises could not again operate with impunity. The investigation had provided a model for addressing environmental crime while also revealing the ongoing challenges that communities faced in protecting environmental health and democratic participation. The quiet satisfaction that characterized the conclusion of the investigation reflected the professional dedication and community commitment that had made justice possible despite powerful opposition. The case had demonstrated that truth and justice could prevail when supported by careful investigation, community solidarity, and the courage of individuals who were willing to sacrifice for the common good. As evening settled over Westfield, the community began the long process of healing and recovery that would transform the trauma of environmental crime into renewed commitment to environmental protection and community welfare. Dr. Thornfield's return to his family and community had provided hope and inspiration while also serving as a reminder of the price that environmental advocates sometimes paid for their dedication to protecting the earth and its inhabitants. The investigation had ended, but its legacy would continue through enhanced environmental protection, strengthened community resilience, and the ongoing work of environmental advocates who would carry forward Dr. Thornfield's commitment to scientific truth and environmental justice. The case had demonstrated that individual courage and community solidarity could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises when supported by dedicated law enforcement and persistent pursuit of truth and justice. In the quiet hours of the evening, as the city settled into peaceful rest, the memory of Dr. Thornfield's courage became part of the community's collective story, a story that would inspire future generations of environmental advocates and remind them that the pursuit of environmental protection was worth any sacrifice and that truth, once revealed, could never again be silenced by those who would profit from environmental destruction and community suffering. Dr. Edward Thornfield stood in his garden on Sycamore Avenue as the October morning light filtered through the maple trees that had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, their colors reflecting the quiet transformation that had settled over the Riverside neighborhood. In the months following his rescue and the dismantling of the criminal enterprise that had held him captive for nearly 8 months, the garden that he had been forced to abandon during his disappearance had been carefully tended by neighbors and friends, their collective care creating something more beautiful than what had existed before his ordeal. The physical recovery from his captivity had required months of medical treatment and rehabilitation, but the psychological healing had been supported by the gradual return to routines and relationships that had given meaning to his life before the criminal organization had targeted him for his environmental research. The simple act of working in soil that was finally being cleaned of industrial contamination had become a form of meditation that connected him to the earth he had spent his career trying to protect. Mrs. Margaret Hastings arrived at 7 o'clock, precisely for their weekly chess game, a ritual that had resumed at the Riverside Community Library once Dr. Thornfield had recovered sufficiently to concentrate on the complex strategic thinking that their matches required. The chess games had become symbols of normalcy, returning to lives that had been disrupted by criminal violence, their quiet intellectual competition representing the triumph of civilized discourse over the fagus of the intimidation and fear that had characterized the neighborhood during the height of the criminal campaign. The library itself had been rebuilt with enhanced security, features, and expanded environmental archives that would preserve the historical documentation that had been destroyed in the fire that had eliminated much of the evidence supporting Dr. Thornfield's research. The new archives had been designed as a resource for future environmental advocates and researchers who would continue the work of documenting and protecting environmental health throughout the region. Riverside Community Center had become the headquarters for ongoing environmental monitoring and community education activities that were being conducted as part of the settlement agreements that had been negotiated with the corporations and governmental agencies that had been found liable for environmental crimes and regulatory failures. The community center's role in environmental protection had transformed it from a simple social facility into a symbol of democratic participation in environmental decision-making. Dr. Thornfield's return to his environmental research had been supported by the establishment of the Thornfield Environmental Justice Institute, a research center that had been funded through asset forfeiture recoveries and settlement agreements with corporations that had participated in or benefited from the criminal enterprise. The institute had been designed to continue Dr. Thornfield's work while also providing resources and protection for environmental advocates who faced threats and intimidation. Institute's research activities had focused on developing improved methods for detecting and documenting environmental contamination, while also creating legal and scientific resources that could support community advocacy efforts. The work had been conducted in partnership with universities, environmental organizations, and community groups that shared commitments to environmental protection and social justice. Detective Captain Amanda Foster had been promoted to serve as liaison between law enforcement agencies and environmental protection organizations, a position that had been created in recognition of the need for enhanced coordination between criminal justice and environmental regulatory systems. Her new responsibilities had included developing training programs for law enforcement personnel who might encounter environmental crimes and creating protocols for investigating complex criminal enterprises that operated across multiple jurisdictions. The prosecution of the criminal enterprise had resulted in convictions and substantial prison sentences for all major defendants, including Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who had been sentenced to 35 years in federal prison for her role in organizing and directing the criminal activities. The successful prosecutions had sent clear messages that environmental crimes would be investigated and prosecuted regardless of the resources and political connections possessed by criminal organizations. The environmental remediation activities that had been ongoing throughout the region had made significant progress in cleaning up contamination and preventing future environmental damage. But the work had also revealed the extent to which industrial pollution had affected community health and environmental quality over decades of inadequate regulatory oversight. The cleanup efforts had required coordination between multiple agencies and substantial financial investments that would continue for years. The health monitoring programs that had been established for community members who had been exposed to environmental contamination had revealed both immediate health impacts and long-term risks that would require ongoing medical surveillance and treatment. The health programs had been designed to provide comprehensive care while also conducting research that could inform environmental health protection efforts in other communities. Mrs. Helen Patterson had returned to her role as informal community leader, but her activities had expanded to include coordination with regional environmental advocacy networks that had been strengthened by the successful investigation and prosecution of the criminal enterprise. Her work had demonstrated how community organizing could be enhanced through connections with broader social movements, while maintaining focus on local environmental and social justice concerns. The neighborhood watch activities that had developed during the period of criminal harassment had evolved into ongoing community security and environmental monitoring programs that provided both practical protection and opportunities for community engagement. The programs had demonstrated how communities could develop resilience and self-protection capabilities while also maintaining cooperation with law enforcement agencies. Dr. Maria Santos had continued her medical practice while also serving as a consultant for environmental health monitoring programs that had been established throughout the region. Her work had provided crucial links between community health concerns and environmental protection efforts while also demonstrating the importance of medical professionals in documenting and addressing environmental health impacts. The Riverside Creek Restoration Project had made substantial progress in cleaning up water pollution and restoring aquatic habitats that had been damaged by decades of industrial contamination. The restoration work had been conducted as a partnership between governmental agencies, environmental organizations, and community volunteers who had contributed thousands of hours of labor to the cleanup efforts. The creek restoration had become a symbol of environmental recovery and community resilience, with regular volunteer workdays that brought together residents from throughout the region who shared commitments to environmental protection and community welfare. The restoration work had provided opportunities for environmental education and community building while also creating tangible improvements in environmental quality. Marcus Rodriguez had expanded his plumbing business to include environmental remediation and green building services that supported community efforts to reduce environmental impacts and improve energy efficiency. His business had benefited from increased demand for environmental services, while also contributing to broader environmental protection efforts throughout the region. The construction industry's response to the investigation had included enhanced training and certification programs for contractors who worked on projects that involved environmental remediation or energy efficiency improvements. The industry initiatives had been designed to ensure that construction activities supported rather than undermined environmental protection goals. Susan Martinez had overseen the expansion of the library's environmental education programs, which had included partnerships with schools, environmental organizations, and research institutions that provided resources for community members who were interested in environmental advocacy and protection. The library's role in environmental education had demonstrated how community institutions could support democratic participation in environmental decision-making. The educational programs had included workshops on environmental monitoring, advocacy, skills, and legal rights that had empowered community members to participate effectively in environmental protection efforts. The programs had also provided networking opportunities that had strengthened connections between local advocates and regional environmental organizations. Benjamin Turner had become involved in green building advocacy and had worked with other contractors to promote construction practices that supported environmental protection and energy efficiency. His advocacy work had included lobbying for building codes and regulations that would require environmental protection measures while also providing business opportunities for contractors who specialized in green building techniques. The construction industry's adoption of green building practices had been supported by financial incentives and technical assistance programs that had been established as part of the environmental remediation efforts. The programs had demonstrated how environmental protection could be integrated with economic development in ways that benefited both environmental quality and business prosperity. Dr. Sarah Kim had continued her environmental health research while also serving as an advisor for community health monitoring programs that had been established in response to environmental contamination concerns. Her work had provided scientific support for community advocacy efforts, while also contributing to broader understanding of environmental health impacts and protection strategies. The research activities had included studies of environmental health impacts among vulnerable populations, including children and elderly residents who had been disproportionately affected by environmental contamination. The research had provided evidence for policy recommendations and regulatory improvements that could better protect community health. Detective Michael Torres had been assigned to a specialized environmental crimes unit that had been established to investigate and prevent environmental crimes throughout the region. His work had included training and coordination activities that had enhanced law enforcement capabilities for addressing environmental crimes and supporting environmental advocacy efforts. The Environmental Crimes Unit had developed partnerships with regulatory agencies, environmental organizations, and community groups that had enhanced coordination between law enforcement and environmental protection efforts. The partnerships had provided resources and expertise that had improved the effectiveness of both criminal justice and environmental regulatory systems. Detective Jennifer Walsh had continued her work on complex investigations while also serving as a trainer for law enforcement personnel who might encounter environmental crimes or organized criminal enterprises. Her training activities had included development of investigative techniques and coordination protocols that could be used by other law enforcement agencies facing similar challenges. The training programs had been designed to share lessons learned from the Westfield investigation while also developing standardized approaches to environmental crime investigation that could be implemented by law enforcement agencies with varying levels of resources and expertise. Detective Robert Kim had been promoted to supervise community relations activities that were designed to strengthen cooperation between law enforcement agencies and community organizations. His work had included development of community policing programs that had enhanced public safety while also supporting community organizing and advocacy efforts. The community relations programs had demonstrated how law enforcement could support rather than undermine democratic participation and social justice advocacy, providing models that could be implemented by other agencies that were interested in improving community relations and public safety outcomes. Lieutenant David Park had been assigned to coordinate regional search and rescue operations while also serving as liaison with environmental protection agencies that might require law enforcement support for monitoring and enforcement activities. His work had provided enhanced capabilities for both emergency response and environmental protection efforts. The search and rescue capabilities that had been developed during the investigation had been maintained and enhanced to provide ongoing resources for emergency response and public safety protection. The capabilities had also been made available to support environmental monitoring and protection efforts that might require specialized personnel and equipment. Detective Sarah Chun had been promoted to head a regional cybercrime unit that specialized in investigating criminal enterprises that use technology to support illegal activities. Her work had included development of technical capabilities and legal procedures that could be used to investigate sophisticated criminal organizations that operated across multiple jurisdictions. The cybercrime unit had established partnerships with federal agencies and international law enforcement organizations that had enhanced capabilities for investigating criminal enterprises that use technology to support illegal activities. The partnerships had provided resources and expertise that had improved the effectiveness of criminal justice responses to organized crime. As Dr. Thornfield prepared for another day of environmental research and community engagement, he reflected on the way that individual courage and community solidarity had ultimately prevailed against sophisticated criminal enterprises that had possessed substantial resources and political connections. The investigation and its aftermath had demonstrated that environmental protection and democratic participation could be maintained when supported by dedicated individuals and strong community institutions. The environmental research that Dr. Thornfield had resumed had been enhanced by improved scientific resources and legal protections that had been established as part of the institutional reforms that had followed the investigation. The research had also been supported by collaborative relationships with other scientists and advocates. who shared commitments to environmental protection and social justice. The community that had emerged from the crisis had been strengthened by shared experiences of resistance and recovery that had created bonds of trust and mutual support that had not existed before the criminal enterprise had targeted environmental advocates. The community solidarity had provided foundations for ongoing environmental protection and democratic participation that would continue long after the immediate crisis had passed. The quiet satisfaction that characterized life in the Riverside neighborhood reflected not just the resolution of immediate threats, but the development of community capabilities and institutional protections that could prevent similar problems in the future. The community had learned that environmental protection required constant vigilance and active participation, but it had also discovered that such participation could be supported by strong institutions and collaborative relationships. As evening settled over Westfield, the community continued its daily routines with the confidence that came from having faced serious challenges and emerged stronger and more unified. The lessons of courage and solidarity that had been learned during the crisis had become part of the community's collective memory and would guide future efforts to protect environmental health and democratic participation. The story of Dr. Thornfield's courage and the community's response had become part of the ongoing narrative of environmental protection and social justice that would inspire future generations of advocates and remind them that individual dedication and community solidarity could overcome even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The quiet strength that had emerged from crisis would continue to protect and nurture the community for years to come.